There is a moment in history when a society reaches a point where it simply cannot hold itself together any longer. France, in the late 1700s, was exactly that kind of society. For centuries, a small number of people had held almost everything: the land, the money, the power, the future, while millions of others went hungry, worked themselves to exhaustion, and paid taxes on things as basic as salt. What happened next changed not just France, but the shape of the modern world in ways that are still visible today. If this is your first time here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. It genuinely helps more than you might think. And drop a comment below letting me know where in the world you are watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always love reading those. Whether it is a quiet evening or the early hours of the morning, I am glad you found your way here. Go ahead and get comfortable now. Set the phone down somewhere easy to reach, pull the blanket up a little, and let your shoulders drop. Tonight, we are drifting back to France, to a world of gilded palaces and empty bread baskets, of restless philosophers and exhausted peasants, of a king who could not quite grasp what was building around him, and a people who had finally decided they were done waiting. This is the story of the French Revolution. France in the 1700s was one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. It had been for a long time. Its army was formidable, its culture was admired across the continent, and its capital, Paris, was considered by many to be the intellectual and cultural centre of the Western world. The French language was the language of diplomacy, of philosophy, of polite conversation from Madrid to St. Petersburg. If you wanted to be taken seriously in the courts of Europe, you spoke French, dressed in French fashions, and ideally had some passing familiarity with French manners. But underneath all of that prestige, something had been quietly wearing thin for generations. The Kingdom of France operated on a system that had been in place, in one form or another, since the Middle Ages. It was a system built on the assumption that people were not equal, not legally, not economically, not in any practical sense. The king sat at the top of everything, ruling by what was understood to be divine right, meaning God had placed him there, and that was the end of the discussion. Below him, French society was divided into three formal categories, known as the three estates. The clergy occupied the first estate, the nobility held the second, and then everyone else. The vast majority of French men and women was bundled into the third estate, which was less a category and more of a catch-all for anyone who did not fit into the other two. The clergy, the first estate, controlled enormous amounts of land and institutional power. The Catholic Church owned somewhere between 6 and 10% of all the land in France. It ran hospitals, schools, and charitable institutions across the country. It collected a religious contribution called the tithe from ordinary French people, a kind of compulsory donation built into the structure of daily life. And in exchange for all of this wealth and influence, the church paid almost no taxes to the crown. Instead, it made what were called voluntary contributions, referred to officially as free gifts, which was, when you consider it plainly, a remarkably polite name for an arrangement where one of the richest institutions in the country had successfully talked its way out of paying its share. The nobility, the second estate, occupied a similarly insulated position. Noble families held large estates across the French countryside and carried exclusive rights to certain positions in the military, the government, and the royal court at Versailles. They were exempt from most of the major taxes that pressed down on ordinary people. Some noble families were genuinely and extravagantly wealthy. Others were noble in name and tradition but had very little actual money to show for it. Still, even an impoverished nobleman held legal privileges that no commoner could access, and those privileges mattered in ways both large and small. Then there was everyone else. The third estate contained multitudes. It included wealthy merchants and successful lawyers in the cities, educated professionals who had read the Enlightenment philosophers and held strong opinions about government, skilled craftsmen and shopkeepers who kept the urban economy running, and then, making up the overwhelming majority: the rural peasantry. Farmers who worked land they frequently did not own, who paid rent to landlords, tithes to the church, and taxes to the crown on almost everything they produced or consumed. There were dues owed to local lords for the use of mills and ovens and roads. There were fees attached to buying and selling goods. And there was the gabelle, the salt tax, one of the most widely hated impositions in French history, not because salt was a luxury, but precisely because it was not. Salt was essential for preserving food through the long winter months. Taxing it was the kind of policy that settled into people's memories and stayed there. France in this period was also a country of remarkable geographic and cultural variety. The north differed from the south in language, custom, and economy. The cities were worlds apart from the countryside. People in different regions lived under slightly different legal arrangements, spoke different local dialects, and had very different relationships with the central administration in Paris. The sense of France as a single unified nation with shared identity and common purpose was still incomplete, still more of an aspiration than an everyday reality for most of its people. Paris itself held roughly 600,000 inhabitants, enormous by the standards of the time, and among the largest cities in the world. It was a city of sharp contrasts that sat right next to each other without much separation. Grand public squares and fashionable shops occupied streets near the Seine, while just a short walk away the working class and poor districts were crowded, dark, and frequently unhealthy. Disease moved easily through densely packed neighbourhoods. Clean water was not guaranteed. The gap between what the city looked like in its public-facing grandeur and what it felt like to actually live there for most of its residents was considerable. Food, or more precisely, the constant uncertainty around it, shaped the texture of Parisian life in ways that defined almost everything else. The average working-class family in the city spent somewhere between half and three-quarters of their income on bread alone, not on food broadly, on bread specifically. When the harvest was poor and grain prices climbed, the consequences arrived quickly and personally. Families ate less, children went without. Men who had been managing on modest incomes found themselves suddenly unable to cover the most basic necessity. The distance between getting by and genuine crisis was not very wide, and bad weather could close it entirely. The French countryside carried its own pressures. Most of the population, perhaps 4 out of every 5 French people, lived in rural areas, working within a system that still bore the marks of feudalism. Even centuries after that system had technically begun to soften. Dues were owed to local lords. Portions of harvests changed hands. Labour obligations lingered in various forms. Strict serfdom in the legal sense had largely faded in France by the 1700s, unlike in parts of Eastern and Central Europe. But the practical weight of what peasants owed, and to whom, had not disappeared with the legal terminology. What made this structure feel increasingly fragile by the 1780s was not that it had suddenly become more unjust. It had been unjust for a very long time, but that more people were beginning to name that injustice, and to frame it in a language that demanded answers the old system simply could not provide. Words like rights, liberty, and representation were circulating in ways they had not a generation before. The American Revolution of 1776 had demonstrated, in a way that was hard to dismiss, that an old colonial arrangement could be dismantled and replaced with something built on different principles. France had helped fund and fight that war, the practical purpose being to weaken Britain, but the ideas that soldiers and officers carried home proved far more difficult to contain than anyone in Versailles had considered. By the late 1780s, the Crown was also deeply in debt. Years of expensive military campaigns, the American war among them, had emptied the royal treasury. Every reasonable attempt to reform the tax system collided with the same obstacle. The nobility refused, consistently and firmly, to surrender their exemptions. Without broadening the tax base to include those who actually had wealth, the numbers simply did not work. The kingdom had painted itself into a corner, and the king, who would have preferred to do almost anything else, was being asked to find a way out. The three estates and a kingdom on the edge. To understand what France was about to go through, it helps to slow down for a moment and look at the country not from the perspective of kings and politicians, but from the ground level, from the texture of ordinary daily life across the three estates. Because the revolution that was coming was not simply a disagreement about political theory. It was rooted in something far more immediate, in what people ate, what they wore, how they spent their days, and how clearly they could see the distance between their own lives and the lives of those who governed them. The French court at Versailles was, by any measure, one of the most elaborate human constructions in history, not just as a building, but as a social performance. King Louis XIV had moved the court there in 1682, and in doing so had essentially invented a new way of organising the nobility. By pulling the great aristocratic families close to the palace and surrounding them with ceremony, ritual and competition for royal favour, he had transformed potential rivals into courtiers, people whose days were structured around formal attendance at the king's levee, his meals, his walks in the garden. There was a specific nobleman whose role it was to hand the king his shirt each morning. There were rules governing who could speak to whom and in which room. The whole edifice was magnificent, and if you paused to think about it plainly, slightly absurd. The nobility who lived within this world dressed accordingly. For men of the Second Estate, the standard of formal court dress involved knee breeches, silk stockings, embroidered coats, and powdered wigs, an ensemble that communicated wealth, rank, and the important fact that one did not do manual labour. The wig alone required maintenance. The embroidery on a fashionable coat could cost more than a working family's entire annual income. Lace was significant at the cuffs, at the collar, and the quality of one's lace communicated status in a way that contemporaries read instinctively. Women of the court wore gowns with wide panniers extending the skirts dramatically to the side, corseted bodices, and elaborately dressed hair, often built up with wireframes and decorated with ribbons, feathers, flowers, and occasionally small ornamental structures that required their own engineering. Marie Antoinette, when she arrived at Versailles from Vienna as a teenage bride, quickly became the defining figure of this aesthetic commissioning. Extraordinary confections from her dressmaker Rose Bertin, and setting fashions that rippled through aristocratic Europe. The food at the French court matched this scale. Royal dinners involved dozens of courses served in elaborate sequence, drawing on the resources of elaborate kitchen departments staffed with hundreds of workers. Game birds, freshwater fish, elaborate pastries, sauces built through days of careful preparation. These were the rhythms of aristocratic eating. Wine from the great estates of Burgundy and Bordeaux, coffee and chocolate, still relative novelties, served in fine porcelain, fruit forced into season ahead of time through the careful management of heated garden walls. If the nobility had any complaint about food, it was a matter of preference rather than availability. The bourgeoisie, the wealthier layer of the Third Estate, occupied a different kind of world, though one that aspired in some ways toward the aristocratic model. A prosperous merchant or lawyer in Paris or Lyon dressed well, though within limits. Fine wool coats, respectable hats, good leather shoes, clothing that communicated success without reaching for the embroidery and silk of the court. They ate solidly, with access to a broad range of foods, meat several times a week, vegetables, wine, butter. They hired domestic servants, owned books, sent their sons to school, and participated in the salon culture that had become one of the defining features of educated Parisian life. Salons gatherings hosted usually by educated women of means, where intellectuals, writers, scientists, and engaged amateurs discussed ideas were where the Enlightenment found one of its most important homes. The philosophes Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot were not writing in isolation. They were writing in a world where their ideas circulated quickly and reached people who were ready to do something with them. The artisan and working-class layers of the Third Estate lived in a sharper world. A skilled tradesman, a carpenter, a printer, a glassworker might earn a modest but livable income in good times, wearing practical wool clothing, eating bread as the foundation of nearly every meal, drinking wine diluted with water, and living in rented rooms in the crowded urban quarters. The workday was long, regulated loosely by trade guilds that controlled who could practice witchcraft and under what conditions. These men and their families were not destitute by default, but they were exposed. A spike in bread prices, a period of unemployment, a harsh winter, an illness, any of these could push a family from stability into genuine hardship with very little warning. At the very base of French society were the rural peasantry, and their lives were shaped almost entirely by the rhythms of agriculture and the obligations attached to land. A typical peasant family in the French countryside in the 1780s lived in a house of stone or rough timber with a dirt floor, minimal furniture, and a fire that served for both cooking and heat. Clothing was homespun wool or coarse linen, practical, durable, and repaired until it could no longer hold together. The diet centered on bread dark, dense, made from rye or mixed grains rather than the white wheat bread associated with the cities, along with whatever vegetables could be grown in a kitchen garden. Turnips, leeks, cabbages, onions. Meat appeared rarely, perhaps for festivals or when an animal became too old to work. Salt pork, dried beans, and whatever could be foraged or hunted filled the gaps. Wine, in the wine-producing regions, was present even for the poor, though of a quality that bore no resemblance to what was being poured at Versailles. What made this situation volatile was not simply the poverty itself. Generations of French peasants had lived this way without revolution, but the particular combination of pressure that had been building through the 1780s. Taxation had been climbing. Local seigneurial dues, the fees and obligations owed to local lords, had in many regions been tightened and expanded rather than relaxed, a process historians later called the feudal reaction. Landlords, squeezed by their own financial difficulties, looked for ways to extract more from the land and the people working it. And then, beginning in 1788, the weather intervened. The harvest of 1788 was a catastrophe. A severe drought through the summer damaged crops across France. Then, a devastating hailstorm in July, one of the worst in living memory, flattened standing grain across entire provinces. What survived the summer was then threatened by one of the harshest winters in decades, which froze rivers, blocked roads, halted trade, and killed livestock. By the winter of 1788 to 89, bread prices had reached levels that placed the staple food of ordinary people effectively out of reach for the poorest households. In Paris, workers were spending upward of 80 or 90% of their daily wages on bread alone, not to eat well, but simply to not starve. This combination, a society already divided by profound legal and economic inequality, a crown already incapacitated by debt, a nobility unwilling to bear any portion of the tax burden, and now a genuine food crisis pressing on millions of already strained families, produced a pressure that the political structures of the old regime were simply not built to absorb. Meanwhile, the ideas being generated by the Enlightenment had been doing their slow work. Books and pamphlets circulated in ways that would have been difficult to control, even if the authorities had tried harder. Coffee houses in Paris had hundreds of them. By the 1780s served as informal reading rooms and discussion spaces where news, opinion, and argument passed between people of different backgrounds. The Great Encyclopédie, the massive collaborative project edited by Denis Diderot and Jean-Le-Rond d'Alembert, had spent decades organizing and publishing human knowledge in a form that implicitly challenged the idea that truth was the exclusive property of the church or the crown. You could look up how a printing press worked, how dyes were made, how governments had been organized across history, and somewhere in the act of looking things up, the habit of questioning settled arrangements became easier. What the Enlightenment gave ordinary educated French people was not a revolution plan. It gave them a vocabulary, and that turned out to be enough. Words like natural rights, popular sovereignty, the social contract, the general will, these were not just philosophical abstractions. They were frameworks for looking at a society where one group paid no taxes, another paid almost all of them, and a king ruled by divine right, and asking a question that had become very difficult to answer. On what basis, exactly, was any of this justified? The France of 1789 was not a country that woke up one morning and decided to make a revolution. It was a country that had been under accumulating strain for decades, where a food crisis had finally made that strain unbearable, and where enough people had enough of a new language to begin saying, out loud and to each other, that things could be different, that they should be different, that perhaps quietly, then less quietly they would be. Louis XVI and the weight of a crown. Louis XVI became King of France in 1774 at the age of 19. He had not expected it quite so soon. His father, Louis the Dauphin, had died in 1765, which meant the crown passed through his grandfather, Louis XV, and then directly to him, a young man who, by nearly all accounts from those who knew him, was decent, conscientious, and profoundly unsuited to the particular moment in history he had been handed. This is not to say he was stupid. He was not. He spoke several languages, had a serious interest in geography and cartography, kept detailed journals, and had a genuine mechanical aptitude. He was, by his own preference, happiest in his locksmith workshop at Versailles, where he designed and crafted locks with real technical skill. In different circumstances, in a different century, he might have made an excellent engineer or a perfectly competent country gentleman. What he was not, and what his era required above almost everything else, was a decisive political actor, capable of reading rapidly shifting situations and responding with authority and clarity. Those who observed Louis up close often described the same quality, a kind of hesitancy that lived in the space between receiving advice and acting on it. He would listen to his ministers carefully, ask reasonable questions, appear to reach a decision, and then, when pressed by competing counsel or by his own uncertainty, pull back. He was not a tyrant in the traditional mould. He did not rule through fear or cruelty, but he also lacked the political instincts that might have allowed him to navigate the gathering storm with enough flexibility to survive it. The French monarchy in 1774 needed someone who could reform without being forced to, who could give ground strategically before circumstances made retreat a humiliation. Louis gave ground too slowly, and usually only when he had no remaining choice. His personal life was, in its early years, a subject of considerable public interest and considerable mockery. His marriage to Marie Antoinette, Archduchess of Austria, had been arranged as a diplomatic alliance between the Bourbon and Habsburg dynasties, cementing the union of two great Catholic powers against their shared rivals. She was 14 when she arrived in France. He was 15. The marriage was, in its first years, unconsummated, a fact that became an open secret at court and the subject of anxious correspondence between Marie Antoinette and her mother, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, who sent increasingly pointed letters inquiring about the situation. The problem was resolved. Eventually their first child arrived in 1778, but not before years of whispered gossip had attached themselves to both the Queen and the King in ways that neither would fully escape. Marie Antoinette was, by any measure, a more commanding presence than her husband. She was beautiful, vivacious, socially confident, and highly intelligent in the practical sense of understanding people and situations quickly. She had been raised at one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe, and she arrived in Versailles with a natural ease in social settings that Louis, who was shy and often awkward in public ceremonies, conspicuously lacked. She loved music, dancing, theatre, and fashion. Her enthusiasm for all of these was genuine and considerable, and in the early years of her time at Versailles, these tastes seemed to those around her like the entirely natural pleasures of a young, high-spirited queen. The problem was that France was not in a position to sustain them indefinitely. Marie Antoinette's spending attracted criticism that ranged from reasonable to wildly exaggerated, depending on the source. She did spend large sums on clothing and jewellery. Her private retreat, the Petit Trianon, a smaller palace within the Versailles grounds, was renovated and decorated according to her personal taste, including the famous Hameau de la Reine, the small artificial rustic hamlet where she and her close companions could pretend, in a slightly theatrical way, to enjoy the simple country life. She spent heavily on gambling during a period when that was a fashionable court pastime. These were real expenditures, though historians have pointed out, with some justification, that they were not actually the cause of France's financial crisis. That crisis had roots going back decades and involved military spending, structural debt, and fundamental tax failures that no queen's wardrobe could have meaningfully created or resolved. But the perception was another matter entirely. Pamphlets attacking Marie Antoinette began circulating in Paris during the 1780s, and they grew progressively uglier as the decade advanced. She was given the nickname Madame Deficit, as if the entire financial collapse of the French state had been purchased through her extravagance. More vicious pamphlets made explicitly sexual accusations against her that bore no relationship to reality. This kind of material spread through the same coffee houses and print networks that circulated Enlightenment philosophy, and it did real damage not just to the Queen's reputation, but to the prestige of the monarchy itself. When the institution of kingship depended on a degree of reverence and distance, the spectacle of the Queen being depicted in obscene terms in cheap pamphlets sold on street corners was genuinely corrosive. The financial crisis that Louis inherited, and that deepened through his reign, had structural causes that went well beyond the court's habits. France had fought expensive wars throughout the 18th century, the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, and then the American Revolutionary War, in which France spent enormous sums supporting the colonists against Britain. The American intervention in particular cost France somewhere in the range of 1.3 billion livres, a figure that had effectively no precedent in peacetime French budgeting. By the early 1780s, debt service alone, simply paying the interest on what France owed, consumed more than half of the Crown's annual revenue. The obvious solution was tax reform. France's tax system was a patchwork of historical exemptions, regional variations, and institutionalized inequalities that effectively protected those most capable of contributing from having to do so. The clergy paid voluntary contributions instead of taxes. The nobility held exemptions from the principal direct taxes. The tax burden fell with full weight on the Third Estate, including the prosperous bourgeoisie, who were increasingly aware of the injustice, while those with the most wealth were the least exposed to it. Louis tried, on more than one occasion, to push through reforms that would have made the system more rational. He appointed capable ministers, Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, in the early years of his reign, Jacques Necker, somewhat later, who drew up serious plans for fiscal reform. Turgot proposed abolishing the guilds, reforming the grain trade, and replacing corvée labour obligations with a cash tax that would apply more broadly across social classes. The nobility and the Parliament's regional judicial bodies, with a deeply conservative outlook and a habit of blocking reform, resisted vigorously. Louis ultimately dismissed Turgot. Then he dismissed Necker. Then he brought Necker back. The pattern of appointing a reforming minister, encountering resistance, and backing away became a kind of rhythm to the reign action without follow-through, each retreat narrowing the available options slightly further. By 1786, the Crown's financial position had moved from serious to effectively unsustainable. The Controller General of Finances, Charles Alexandre de Calonne, presented Louis with an analysis that was blunt in a way that must have been uncomfortable. France was spending vastly more than it was collecting. The debt was compounding, and the only way out was a comprehensive reform of the tax system, one that would require the nobility to pay their share. To push this through the resistance of the parliaments, Calonne proposed convening an assembly of notables, a hand-picked body of prominent figures from across the kingdom. hoping they would prove more cooperative than the parliaments. They did not. The Assembly of Notables, convened in February 1787, spent most of its time questioning Calonne's figures and defending noble privileges. Calonne was dismissed. His successor, Loménie de Brienne, fared no better with the parliaments. When Louis attempted to force through a package of reforms by royal decree, a process called a lit de justice, the Parliament of Paris declared it illegal and positioned itself as a defender of national liberties. The irony was not lost on observers. An institution that existed largely to protect aristocratic privilege was framing its opposition to tax reform as a principled stand for the rights of the nation. By the summer of 1788, with the harvest failing, debt compounding, and every reform path blocked, Louis faced an option he had long avoided: convening the Estates General. This was a representative body that had not met since 1614, over 170 years. It brought together representatives of all three estates to advise the king, and in this case, to try to find some way through a crisis that the crown could no longer manage alone. Calling the Estates General was an admission that the old machinery had stopped working. It was not, in Louis's mind, an invitation to revolution. He was looking for a supervised, orderly solution to a financial problem, a way to share the burden of reform just enough to make it politically possible, while keeping the fundamental shape of things intact. What he got was something else entirely: bread, debt, and the philosopher's fire. The financial crisis that had brought France to the edge of convening the Estates General did not exist in isolation. It existed alongside something harder to measure but equally consequential: a fundamental shift in how educated French people thought about government, authority, and the relationship between rulers and the ruled. The ideas that had been developing across the century were not abstract matters confined to university lecture halls. They had been moving through French society for decades, finding their way into salons, coffee houses, pamphlets and conversations, reshaping what ordinary people expected from the institutions that governed their lives. This movement had a name: the Enlightenment, and while it was a European phenomenon with important contributors from Britain, Scotland, Germany, and the Netherlands, France sat near its centre. The French philosophers were not a formal school or an organised movement. They were a loose constellation of writers, thinkers, and public intellectuals who shared a general commitment to reason as the proper basis for understanding the world, a scepticism toward institutions that claimed authority without being able to justify it rationally, and a belief that human society could be improved through the application of careful thought and honest inquiry. What they disagreed about, sometimes quite sharply, were the details of what that improvement ought to look like. François-Marie Arouet, who published under the name Voltaire, was the most famous of them during his own lifetime, a condition he clearly enjoyed. He was sharp, prolific, and had a particular gift for making serious intellectual points through wit and satire in a way that made them accessible far beyond the academic world. Voltaire was not a systematic political philosopher in the way that some of his contemporaries were. He did not lay out a detailed blueprint for a reformed French state. What he did, relentlessly, across decades of writing, was attack the targets he found most suffocating: religious intolerance, clerical corruption, arbitrary authority, and the hypocrisy of institutions that claimed virtue while practicing cruelty. His slogan, if he could be said to have one, was directed against the Church as an institution: "Écraser l'infâme, crush the infamous thing." He had spent time in the Bastille for his writing, and had lived for years in exile near the Swiss border, which gave him both the safety to continue writing and an excellent geographic position from which to observe French society without being immediately arrested for his observations. Jean-Jacques Rousseau occupied a different place in the philosophical landscape, more emotional, more radical in certain respects, and in many ways more directly relevant to what the revolution would eventually become. Rousseau's central contribution was the idea that political authority derived its legitimacy not from God or tradition, but from the consent of the governed, from what he called the general will, the collective interest of the people as a whole. His social contract, published in 1762, opened with the famous observation that man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains, a line that lodged itself in the minds of readers in a way that more cautious formulations tended not to. Rousseau argued that legitimate government existed to serve the common good, and that when it failed to do so, the social contract between rulers and the governed was effectively broken. This idea that government was not simply a fact of nature or divine arrangement, but a relationship that carried obligations on both sides was genuinely transformative. It did not necessarily tell people what to do, but it gave them a framework for evaluating what was being done to them and finding it wanting. A peasant who could barely articulate the argument philosophically could still grasp its core, that the arrangement he was living under was not inevitable, not just, and not beyond question. Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, contributed a different but equally important strand. His Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, was a comparative study of legal and political systems across different cultures and historical periods. His central insight that governments functioned best when power was divided and checked against itself, rather than concentrated in a single authority, became foundational to later thinking about constitutional design. The separation of executive, legislative, and judicial powers was not just an abstract preference for Montesquieu. It was, in his analysis, what prevented tyranny from taking hold. When the French reformers of 1789 sat down to think about what a new kind of government might look like, Montesquieu's framework was one of the primary tools they reached for. These three figures and others alongside them, including Denis Diderot, the Marquis de Condorcet, and the economist Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, produced their work in a context where it circulated more widely than almost any previous generation of writers had managed. The printing press had been around for centuries, of course, but the combination of rising literacy, expanding urban networks, and increasing demand for printed material had created something like a genuine reading public by the mid-18th century. Books, pamphlets, periodicals, and the handwritten newsletters called Nouvelles à la Main moved information and opinion through Paris and the provincial cities at a pace that made ideas harder to suppress. The great encyclopédie, the massive collaborative dictionary of arts, sciences, and trades that Diderot and d'Alembert spent decades organizing and publishing, was itself a kind of argument embedded in the form of a reference work. By presenting human knowledge as something organized, systematic, and available to anyone willing to engage with it, it implicitly challenged the idea that truth was the exclusive property of the Church, the Crown, or any other institutional authority. You did not need a bishop's permission to understand how a loom worked, or how ancient republics had governed themselves, or what doctors actually knew about the human body as opposed to what they had been taught to say they knew. The encyclopédie made the act of looking things up feel like an assertion of intellectual independence. The American Revolution of 1776 added a practical dimension that philosophy alone could not provide. Here was a functioning example, imperfect, still taking shape, but real, of a political order built deliberately on principles of natural rights and representative government. The Declaration of Independence had been written in a language that drew explicitly from the same Enlightenment tradition the French philosophes had developed, and it had produced an actual government that claimed to derive its authority from the consent of the governed rather than from God or hereditary right. French officers who had served in the American War, the Marquis de Lafayette, most prominently among them, came back carrying more than military experience. They came back with a first-hand sense that the ideas they had read about in books had been tested in the world and had not immediately collapsed. Lafayette returned to France with a genuine commitment to constitutional government that would make him one of the most prominent figures in the early revolution. He was young, wealthy, idealistic in a way that was sincere rather than merely fashionable, and he had spent enough time in America to know George Washington personally, a relationship that carried considerable prestige on both sides of the Atlantic. His influence would be significant in the early, more optimistic phase of what was coming. The debt crisis and the philosophical ferment were not separate problems sitting beside each other. They were interlocking. The financial crisis made the injustice of the existing system undeniable in practical, immediate terms. The burden fell on those who could least bear it, while those with the most shielded themselves behind privilege. The philosophical tradition gave people a language to articulate what was wrong with that arrangement, in terms that went beyond simple grievance. Taken together, they created something the French state had not previously faced at this scale: a broad, educated, increasingly articulate body of opinion that questioned not just specific policies, but the fundamental legitimacy of the structure itself. It is worth being precise about what this did not mean. It did not mean that most French people in 1788 had a clear picture of what they wanted to replace the existing order with. There was no revolutionary program, no agreed-upon manifesto, no organised party with a coordinated plan. What existed was something more diffuse and in some ways more dangerous, a widespread sense that the current arrangement was indefensible, combined with a vocabulary developed over decades for saying so, and a set of ideas about alternative possibilities that had been circulating long enough to feel at least partially plausible. The harvest failure of 1788 sharpened all of this into something more urgent. Abstract questions about the nature of legitimate government are one thing when bread is affordable. They become something else when a family is spending most of its income just to eat, when the winter is severe, and when news travels through the neighbourhood that the King's Court at Versailles continues its routines with only minor adjustment. The combination of philosophical preparation and physical desperation is a particularly combustible one, and by the early months of 1789, both were fully present. Louis XVI had called the Estates General. It was scheduled to convene in May of 1789. The announcement was met with something that had not been seen in France for generations, a genuine outpouring of political participation. Across the country, the three estates were asked to compile lists of grievances, the cahiers de doléances, for their representatives to bring to the meeting. Millions of French people, in communities large and small, sat down and wrote out what was wrong with their lives and what they hoped might change. The themes were consistent enough to be striking: excessive taxation, unfair privilege, arbitrary justice, and a government that seemed to serve everyone except the people who actually kept it running. The Estates General had not yet convened. The revolution had not yet begun, but France had already started talking, and it was saying things that could not easily be unsaid. The Estates General and the birth of the National Assembly. The Estates General opened on the 5th of May, 1789, in the Salle des Menus Plaisirs at Versailles, a large hall that had been hastily prepared for the occasion. Nearly 1,200 deputies had travelled from across France to attend, representing all three estates, carrying with them the cahiers de doléances that their communities had spent weeks composing. The atmosphere was charged with something that sat between hope and anxiety, a collective sense that this gathering mattered in a way that few political events in living memory had. The ceremony of the opening was managed, as so many things at Versailles were, with careful attention to the visible markers of social hierarchy. Deputies of the First and Second Estates, the clergy and the nobility, arrived in their formal robes, which were elaborate and expensive and communicated rank at a glance. The clergy wore their ecclesiastical vestments. The nobility appeared in black silk coats with gold embroidery, plumed hats, and the particular air of men accustomed to being looked at. The deputies of the Third Estate, by contrast, were required to appear in plain black, no embroidery, no plumes, no silk. They were to be visibly distinguishable from their social superiors at all times, in case anyone forgot where everyone stood. Given that the Third Estate outnumbered both other estates combined, this was the kind of detail that stuck in people's memories and generated considerable resentment before a single speech had been delivered. The procedural question that dominated the opening days was one that sounds technical, but was, in practice, fundamental. How would voting work? The traditional method, the one the Crown and the nobility both assumed would be used, was voting by order. Each estate would deliberate separately and cast a single collective vote. This meant that the clergy and the nobility, voting together, could always outvote the Third Estate 2-1, regardless of how many deputies the Third Estate had sent. The Third Estate had secured a concession earlier in the year, double representation, meaning they sent roughly 600 deputies compared to around 300 each for the other two estates. But double representation was meaningless if voting remained by order. The Third Estate wanted voting by head, meaning each deputy, regardless of which estate he represented, would cast one vote. This would give the 600 Third Estate deputies genuine influence, particularly since a number of sympathetic clergy and a smaller number of liberal nobles were likely to vote with them on key issues. The difference between the two methods was not procedural hair-splitting. It was the difference between a meeting that could actually reform France and one that would reliably preserve the existing order. Louis and his ministers hesitated on this question, which was, at this point in the reign, a deeply familiar pattern. No clear ruling came from the crown. Weeks passed. The three estates sat in separate rooms. The clergy deliberated among themselves. The nobility deliberated among themselves. The Third Estate deliberated among themselves and grew steadily more frustrated with the arrangement. They had come to Versailles believing that this was a genuine opportunity for change. What they were encountering looked increasingly like a system designed to absorb their energy without allowing them to accomplish anything. By early June, the patience of the Third Estate deputies had effectively run out. On the 10th of June, a deputy named Emmanuel Joseph CS, who had already made his name with a pamphlet earlier in the year titled, "What is the Third Estate?", which had answered its own question with the quietly explosive claim that the Third Estate was everything, had been nothing, and asked to be something proposed that the Third Estate simply proceed without the other estates. They invited the clergy and nobility to join them. Some did, most did not. And on the 17th of June, 1789, the assembled deputies took a step that transformed the entire nature of the gathering. They declared themselves a National Assembly. This was not a reform proposal, it was a claim. The deputies of the Third Estate, joined by a handful of sympathetic clergy, were asserting that legitimate political authority in France did not rest with the king alone, or with the privileged estates, but with the nation itself. The National Assembly did not ask permission to exist. It declared itself into existence on the basis of a principle that the representatives of the French people, meeting together, constituted the legitimate governing body of France. Louis had called the Estates General to help him solve a financial problem. The Third Estate had just informed him, in polite but unambiguous terms, that the meeting had become something considerably larger than that. The royal court's response came 3 days later. On the 20th of June, the deputies arrived at their meeting hall to find it locked. Royal guards stood at the doors. No explanation was given officially. The hall was being prepared for a royal session, but the deputies understood immediately what was happening. This was an attempt to interrupt the momentum of the National Assembly at a critical moment, to scatter the deputies before they could consolidate what they had declared. It was also, as a tactical decision, a serious miscalculation. The deputies did not go home. They gathered outside, in the rain, and one of their members, a tennis enthusiast named Joseph Ignace Guillotine, who would become famous for something else entirely, somewhat later suggested that a nearby indoor tennis court, the Jeu de Paume, was available. They moved there, and in that long, plain room, with its bare wooden floors and high windows, the deputies of the National Assembly took an oath, the tennis court oath, swearing not to separate until they had given France a constitution. 600 deputies signed it. One refused. His name was recorded carefully. The unanimity was nearly complete, and it was deliberate. They were demonstrating that this was not a faction or a party. It was a nation speaking. The tennis court oath is one of those moments in history that reveals what political will actually looks like when it crystallizes. These were not soldiers, not armed rebels, not street protesters. They were lawyers, doctors, merchants, landowners, and a handful of progressive clergymen who had come to Versailles through legitimate channels, who were operating within the formal invitation of the crown, and who had simply decided that the rules of the game were going to change. The oath they took was binding on each of them personally, publicly, and in writing. They had made it very difficult to walk back. Louis's response over the following days was a mixture of attempted firmness and characteristic retreat. At a royal session on the 23rd of June, he addressed the assembled estates directly, annulling the National Assembly's decrees and ordering the three estates to return to meeting separately. The clergy and the nobility largely complied. The Third Estate did not move. A royal representative arrived to inform them that the king's orders required them to leave. The response attributed to the Comte de Mirabeau, one of the most formidable political figures of the early revolution. A nobleman who had chosen to represent the Third Estate, and whose physical presence and rhetorical power made him a commanding figure in the hall, was direct. "Tell those who sent you that we are here by the will of the people, and we will not leave except at the point of bayonets." Louis, faced with this refusal, gave way. He instructed the remaining nobility and clergy to join the National Assembly. The Assembly, barely a week old, had won its first confrontation with royal authority not through violence, not through threats, but through the refusal to move and the willingness to hold their position under pressure. The significance of what had just happened was not lost on anyone. An institution that had not existed 2 weeks earlier had just compelled the King of France to back down. It had done so by asserting a principle that it represented the nation, and by holding that assertion steadily against the weight of royal displeasure. Louis had not been defeated militarily. He had been outmaneuvered politically by men with no weapons and no formal authority except the one they had created for themselves. Outside Versailles, in Paris, and across the country, news of these events travelled fast. The cahiers de doléances had already demonstrated how much energy existed across France for some kind of change. The events of June gave that energy a focal point. The National Assembly was real. It had stood its ground. And in Paris, where bread prices remained devastating and rumours moved faster than facts, people were watching very carefully to see what the king would do next. What he did next, or more precisely, what his advisers persuaded him to do, was begin moving troops toward Paris. By early July, somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 royal soldiers were being positioned around the capital and at Versailles. The official explanation was that the troops were there to maintain order. The interpretation in Paris was considerably less reassuring. A city already stretched thin by hunger and anxiety, watching soldiers gather on its outskirts, began doing what cities under pressure do. It started to arm itself. The Estates General had arrived at Versailles, looking to solve a financial crisis through negotiation. What had emerged instead was something that no one had quite planned, and no one could yet fully control: a body claiming to speak for the French nation, a king who had lost the first political test of the gathering, and a city of 600,000 people preparing, in various ways, for whatever came next. The Bastille falls and everything changes. The news that broke Paris on the 12th of July, 1789, was the dismissal of Jacques Necker. Necker was the Director General of Finances, a Swiss banker who had become, somewhat improbably, one of the most popular men in France. He had cultivated that popularity carefully, presenting himself as a responsible steward of the public finances and a sympathetic figure relative to the court's more obviously self-interested advisers. His dismissal, announced on a Sunday afternoon, landed in a city already wound tight with anxiety about the troop movements gathering around Paris, and it landed hard. Within hours, crowds had gathered in the gardens of the Palais Royal, a complex owned by the Duke of Orléans, that functioned as one of Paris's great public spaces, full of shops, cafes, and the kind of open-air gathering places where news and rumour moved between people with remarkable speed. A young journalist named Camille Desmoulins climbed onto a table, drew a pistol for dramatic effect, and delivered an improvised speech urging the crowd to arms. He tore a leaf from a tree and pinned it to his hat as a cockade, a symbol that others quickly adopted, before green was abandoned as the colour of the king's unpopular brother and replaced, within a day, with the blue and red of Paris, combined with the white of the Bourbon dynasty, to produce the tricolour that France would carry forward into history. The city did not sleep that night. Crowds moved through the streets. The customs posts at the city's barriers where goods entering Paris were taxed, and which were associated in many people's minds with the economic pressures squeezing urban life, were attacked and burned. Weapons were searched for wherever they might be found. The Hôtel des Invalides, a military hospital and armoury, was raided on the morning of the 14th of July, and the crowd found and seized somewhere around 28,000 muskets along with several cannons. This was a significant haul, but muskets without powder and shot were limited in their usefulness, and the search for gunpowder drew attention in one particular direction: the Bastille. The Bastille Saint-Antoine was a medieval fortress on the eastern edge of Paris, 8 towers, walls nearly 100 feet high, surrounded by a dry moat. It had been built in the 1400s as a military installation and had served various purposes over the centuries, including its most famous one as a royal prison. Its reputation in the popular imagination was considerably more fearsome than its actual function by 1789. It held, on the morning of July the 14th, exactly 7 prisoners. 4 of them were forgers. One was a man detained at the request of his own family for erratic behaviour. One was an Irishman named Major White, whose mental state had been causing concern for some time. And one was the Comte de Solages, imprisoned for what the records describe as sexual crimes against his family, which, given the era's standards for family requests of this kind, could mean several things. It was not exactly a population of political martyrs, but the Bastille was not stormed for its prisoners. It was stormed for its gunpowder. The governor of the Bastille was Bernard-René de Launay, a career military administrator who found himself, on the morning of the 14th, facing a situation that his entire professional life had not prepared him for. A crowd had gathered outside the fortress. It would grow to somewhere between 600 and 1,000 people through the course of the day, and they wanted the gunpowder stored inside. De Launay was not a man built for crisis. He negotiated cautiously, admitted a small delegation inside the outer courtyard, and attempted to buy time while simultaneously sending messages to Versailles asking for instructions. Versailles did not respond in time to be useful, which was also by this point something of a pattern. The precise sequence of what happened next has been disputed since the afternoon it occurred. At some point, whether by misunderstanding, by an unauthorized action within the crowd, or by a decision from de Launay's garrison, the drawbridge of the outer courtyard was lowered. The crowd surged forward, and firing began. The garrison numbered around 82 invalides, older veteran soldiers, and 32 Swiss guards. They held a genuinely defensible position. The crowd that faced them had muskets seized from the invalides that morning, but little coordination and no military organisation. In the initial exchange of fire, the crowd took casualties. Estimates range from around 70 to nearly 100 dead among the attackers over the course of the day. What changed the balance was the arrival of mutinous French Guard soldiers, professional troops who had defected from royal service and brought with them actual military training and, crucially, artillery. With cannon positioned in front of the Bastille, de Launay's position became untenable. He reportedly considered igniting the gunpowder magazine and destroying the fortress and everyone in it, a decision that would have killed a large number of people and resolved the situation in the most final manner imaginable. His garrison talked him out of it. At around 5 in the afternoon, the Bastille surrendered. De Launay was taken into custody by the crowd and marched toward the Hôtel de Ville. He did not arrive. The crowd killed him in the street along with several members of his garrison, and his head, along with others, was carried through Paris on a pike. This was not a detail that anyone had planned. It was the consequence of months of hunger, fear, and accumulated fury meeting an afternoon of violence in a way that produced the kind of collective act that crowds sometimes commit and that individuals, afterward, find difficult to fully account for. It was a signal of what revolutionary violence could look like: spontaneous, brutal, and carrying its own internal logic in the moment, even when it seemed incomprehensible from outside. The fall of the Bastille reached Versailles that evening. Louis, who had gone to bed, was woken by the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt, who brought him the news. The king, still half asleep and processing what he was being told, reportedly asked, "Is this a revolt?" The Duke's response has been remembered ever since. "No, sire. It is a revolution." The distinction mattered. A revolt was a disturbance to be suppressed. A revolution was a change in the nature of things, something that could not simply be put back the way it had been. Whether the Duke actually said this, or whether the story has been improved in the retelling, the exchange captures something real about how the news was being understood at Versailles. Something had shifted in Paris that could not easily be unshifted. Louis's response, over the following days, was to recognize the reality of what had happened, rather than attempt to reverse it by force, a decision that reflected both his genuine reluctance toward bloodshed and a sober assessment of the military situation. The royal troops gathered around Paris were not, it had become clear, reliably willing to fire on French civilians. The French guards had already defected. Other units showed signs of similar sympathy with the crowd. An order to suppress the uprising by force might simply not have been obeyed, and an order that was not obeyed would have destroyed royal authority more completely than any crowd action could. On the 17th of July, Louis came to Paris. He travelled without his guard, entered the Hôtel de Ville, and accepted the tricolour cockade from Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who had been elected mayor of Paris in the confused aftermath of the 14th. He wore the cockade publicly. It was a gesture of recognition, not enthusiastic, not freely chosen, but real. The King of France was acknowledging, in visible symbolic terms, that something had changed. The crowds that lined the streets were told to shout, "Vive le Roi, long live the King," and many of them did, though observers noted at the time that the enthusiasm was more dutiful than spontaneous. Across France, news of the Bastille's fall spread through the summer days with the particular speed that dramatic events always seem to achieve in an era before modern communication. The details changed in transit, the number of prisoners freed grew with each retelling, the garrison's resistance became more formidable, the heroism of the crowd expanded, but the essential fact remained. The people of Paris had stormed a royal fortress, and the king had not been able to stop them, and had then come to Paris and worn their cockade. The symbolic power of that sequence was enormous. The National Assembly, still meeting at Versailles, received the news of the Bastille with a mixture of shock, relief, and a quiet understanding that their own position had just been transformed. Before the 14th of July, they had been a body of deputies making constitutional claims in the face of royal authority that still, ultimately, controlled the army and the apparatus of the state. After the 14th, the calculus was different. The streets of Paris had demonstrated that royal authority had limits, practical, immediate, physical limits, that the crown itself now had to acknowledge. The Bastille was demolished in the months that followed. An entrepreneur named Pierre-François Palloy organised the work, employing hundreds of workers to tear it down stone by stone. He then sold pieces of it, small fragments of the fortress, fashioned into paperweights, miniature replicas, decorative items to a public that could not get enough of the symbolism. 83 boxes of Bastille stone were sent to the 83 new departments of France as commemorative gifts. The man had a talent for merchandising historical moments that was genuinely ahead of its time. The 14th of July became the defining date of the French Revolution, and eventually the national holiday of France, celebrated every year to the present day. Not because it was the most significant moment in the Revolution's long arc several later events would prove more consequential, but because it was the first moment when the abstract claims of the National Assembly became something physical and irreversible in the streets of Paris. The revolution had announced itself in June. In July, it proved that it existed. The Great Fear and the August Decrees. The fall of the Bastille did not calm France. It accelerated it. News of what had happened in Paris on the 14th of July travelled outward through the country along roads, rivers, and the informal networks of merchants, travellers, and local officials who carried information between communities. But it did not travel cleanly. By the time it reached the smaller towns and rural villages of the French countryside, it had mixed with rumour, distortion, and the particular anxieties that had been building in agricultural communities through a terrible winter and a devastating harvest. What emerged in the weeks following the Bastille's fall was something historians would later call the Grande Peur, the Great Fear, a wave of panic and violence that swept through the French countryside during the last weeks of July and the first weeks of August, 1789. The fear had a specific shape. Across different regions of France, rumours spread that brigands' armed bands of desperate men were descending on villages, burning crops, attacking farms, and acting in some accounts as agents of the nobility, hired to punish the peasantry for their growing insubordination. The brigands were largely imaginary. There was no coordinated campaign of noble reprisal, no organised army of destruction moving through the countryside. What existed were scattered incidents of genuine disorder, some looting, some local violence, the ordinary social friction of a society under extreme stress, magnified by fear and transmitted at speed through communities that had every reason to be anxious. The response to the fear was real, even if much of its cause was not. Villages armed themselves. Men who had no weapons improvised them. Local militias formed spontaneously. Church bells rang as alarm signals. In the confusion, communities that were arming to defend themselves against imaginary brigands sometimes directed their fear and anger at the people who were actually present. The local nobility, the landlords, the agents of the seigneurial system that had been extracting dues and obligations from the peasantry for generations. Chateaux were attacked. Estate records the documents that legally established what peasants owed and to whom were burned. In some places this was deliberate and targeted. In others, it was the byproduct of crowds acting in the heat of panic. Either way, the physical destruction of the legal paperwork that underpinned the feudal system was both practically significant and deeply symbolic. You cannot collect a debt whose written record no longer exists. The scale of the violence varied enormously by region. In some areas it was severe, buildings burned, landlords threatened or harmed, generations of accumulated resentment expressed in a few violent nights. In others, the panic passed through without producing much physical destruction, leaving behind only the memory of fear and the lingering question of what might happen next. But across France, the message that the countryside sent to the National Assembly meeting at Versailles was unmistakable. The old system of rural obligations was collapsing, whether the Assembly did anything about it or not. The peasantry was not waiting for constitutional reform to trickle down from the deliberations of lawyers and merchants. They were making their own changes, with whatever tools were available. The National Assembly received this news with alarm, and among its more thoughtful members, with a recognition that they were facing a choice. They could attempt to restore order by suppressing the rural uprisings which would require royal troops, and would align the revolution's formal institutions with the interests of the landlord class against the peasantry that made up the overwhelming majority of the French population. Or they could get ahead of the situation by formally dismantling the legal structure that the countryside was already tearing apart informally. What happened on the night of the 4th of August, 1789, was one of the most extraordinary legislative sessions in the history of any parliament. It began with a noble deputy named the Vicomte de Noailles, who owned very little land himself, which perhaps made generosity easier rising to propose the voluntary surrender of noble privileges. The Duc d'Aiguillon followed with a similar proposal, and then, in a session that continued through the night and acquired a quality that participants would later describe as almost intoxicating, deputies from the nobility and the clergy, began standing in succession to renounce privileges, exemptions, and feudal rights, not because they were being forced to at that particular moment, but in a collective rush of competitive renunciation that took on its own momentum. By the time the session ended, in the early hours of the 5th of August, the legal architecture of French feudalism had been effectively demolished in a single night. Serfdom, what remained of it, was abolished. The tithe, the compulsory contribution to the church, was abolished. Feudal dues were declared redeemable, meaning peasants could buy their way out of obligations rather than being permanently bound to them, though the details of exactly how this would work in practice were left to be sorted out later, and in many cases the financial terms of redemption were set high enough that poorer peasants could not actually afford them. Noble exemptions from taxation were surrendered, exclusive hunting rights were abolished. The system of venal offices, positions in government that had been purchased rather than earned, was declared open to reform. Regional privileges and the particular legal arrangements that had protected different provinces from uniform royal administration were swept away in principle. The August decrees, as this avalanche of legislation came to be known, were genuinely revolutionary in scope. In the space of a few hours, deputies had dismantled arrangements that had structured French rural life for centuries. The speed of it was itself remarkable, a reminder that institutions which appear immovable can sometimes be cleared away with surprising rapidity when the circumstances are right and the will is present. Whether all of those who had renounced their privileges in the heat of that August night fully appreciated what they had given up was another question, and one that would generate considerable legal argument in the weeks and months that followed as the decrees were translated into actual legislation. But the August decrees were only the beginning of what that month produced. The National Assembly had been working throughout the summer on something more fundamental, a statement of the basic principles on which the new French order would be built. On the 26th of August, 1789, they adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It was 17 articles long. It drew heavily on the language and ideas that the Enlightenment had been developing for decades, and it bore a clear resemblance to the American Declaration of Independence and the various state declarations of rights that had emerged from the American constitutional process, not because the French simply copied the Americans, but because both were drawing from the same intellectual sources. The Declaration's opening principles were simple and sweeping. Men were born free and remain free and equal in rights. The purpose of all political association was the preservation of the natural rights of man, liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The principle of sovereignty resided essentially in the nation, and no body or individual could exercise authority that did not proceed from the nation. The law was the expression of the general will, an explicit borrowing from Rousseau. No one could be accused, arrested, or imprisoned except in cases determined by law. Freedom of opinion, including religious opinion, was protected. Freedom of communication of thought and opinion was declared one of the most precious rights of man. These were not modest claims. They were a direct repudiation of the legal and political foundations of the old regime, the divine right of kings, the inherited privilege of nobility, the institutional dominance of the Church over matters of conscience and opinion. Read against the background of the society they were intended to replace. The Declaration was a comprehensive rejection of the world that had existed before July of 1789. It was also, as critics at the time and historians since have noted, incomplete in ways that would generate significant problems. The Declaration spoke of the rights of man, but it said nothing explicit about women. The question of who, precisely, was included in the category of citizen capable of exercising political rights was left ambiguous, and the answers that eventually emerged from the Assembly's constitutional deliberations were considerably narrower than the Declaration's universal language might have suggested. Property qualifications for voting effectively excluded large numbers of the poor men on whose behalf the revolution claimed to speak. Women were excluded from political participation entirely. The rights of enslaved people in France's Caribbean colonies, particularly in Saint-Domingue, which would eventually become Haiti, were not addressed at all, despite the fact that the colonial plantation economy was deeply entangled with French commercial wealth. These contradictions were real, and they would generate their own conflicts as the revolution moved forward. For the moment, however, the Declaration of the Rights of Man stood as a statement of intent, a set of principles that France had committed to publicly, in writing, before its own people and before the watching world. Those principles could be compared against the actual behaviour of the revolutionary government as the months and years progressed. That comparison would sometimes be uncomfortable, but the Declaration's existence meant that the standard had been set, and that anyone who fell short of it could be measured against it. August of 1789 had produced, within the space of a few weeks, the effective end of feudalism in France and a formal statement of the rights that were supposed to govern the new order. The National Assembly had moved faster and further than almost anyone had imagined when the Estates General had opened in May. France was being rebuilt on paper, at least from its foundations. What remained was the considerably harder task of making it work in practice, with a king who had not chosen any of this, a nobility whose renunciations were already being quietly reconsidered in some quarters, a church whose position had been fundamentally altered, and a population whose expectations for what the revolution would deliver had been raised to a height that no set of decrees, however sweeping, could easily satisfy. The Women's March and the King's Retreat. The September of 1789 passed with the National Assembly still working through the complicated business of drafting a constitution, still meeting at Versailles, and still operating at a remove from the city whose mood was increasingly driving events. Paris remained restless. The bread crisis had not resolved itself. The August decrees and the Declaration of the Rights of Man were significant achievements on paper, but paper did not fill a stomach, and the price of bread in the Parisian markets remained at levels that made daily life genuinely desperate for working families. The gap between what the revolution was producing in the form of declarations and what it was delivering in the form of affordable food was a gap that ordinary Parisians were living inside every day. There was also growing suspicion in the city about the king's intentions. Louis had accepted the tricolour cockade in July with visible reluctance. He had not formally approved the August decrees or the Declaration of the Rights of Man. He was dragging his feet on both, offering qualified responses that fell short of full endorsement and that the Assembly's more attentive members read as resistance rather than deliberation. Then, in early October, news reached Paris that produced an immediate and visceral reaction. At a banquet held at Versailles on the 1st of October to welcome a new regiment of Royal Guards, the officers had reportedly trampled the tricolour cockade underfoot and replaced it with the white of the Bourbon dynasty and the black of the Queen's Austrian family. Whether the story was entirely accurate in all its details was almost beside the point. In a city where trust in the royal family was already fragile, the account of soldiers at Versailles discarding the national symbol under the eyes of the King and Queen confirmed exactly what many Parisians had already begun to believe, that the court had not genuinely accepted the revolution, and was waiting for an opportunity to reverse it. The morning of the 5th of October began at the markets. The women of Paris, the market women, the fishwives, the laundresses, the wives of craftsmen and labourers were at the centre of neighbourhood life in a way that went beyond commerce. They were the ones who managed household budgets, who stood in line for bread, who knew exactly how far a daily wage would stretch and exactly where it fell short. On that morning, in the markets of central Paris, a drum began to beat. The precise origin of the march, who started it, whose idea it was, has never been fully established, and may not have been a single person's idea at all. What is clear is that within hours, several thousand women had assembled, that they were armed with whatever came to hand, pikes, pitchforks, kitchen implements, a cannon that they managed to acquire and drag with them, and that they were marching to Versailles. Their demands were specific and practical: bread, and the king's presence in Paris. The first was immediate necessity. The second was political calculation of a kind that the women of the Paris markets understood very well. A king in Paris, surrounded by his people rather than insulated at Versailles behind his court and his guards, would be considerably harder to manipulate into a counter-revolutionary position. Distance from Paris had allowed the court to operate in a different reality from the city it nominally governed. Closing that distance was not just symbolic, it was a structural change in where power actually sat. The march covered roughly 12 miles through October rain. The column grew as it moved. Men joined as well, including members of the National Guard under the Marquis de Lafayette, who found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to manage a situation that was clearly beyond any individual's management. Lafayette had his own complicated loyalties in this period. He believed in constitutional monarchy, in orderly reform, in the possibility of a France that retained a king while operating on genuinely representative principles. He was not a radical, but he was also not willing, or perhaps not able, to stand against the march. He followed it to Versailles, arriving later in the evening with the guard behind him. The king received a delegation of the marching women at the palace. He promised bread. He agreed to approve the August decrees and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the formal endorsements he had been withholding, and signed them that night. The crowd that had marched 12 miles in the rain had achieved in an afternoon what weeks of assembly debate had not. Louis's signature on the Declaration of the Rights of Man was obtained not through political negotiation, but through the physical presence of several thousand cold, wet, and thoroughly determined Parisian women outside his palace gates. The night passed with an uneasy quiet at Versailles. The crowd camped on the palace grounds, in the courtyards and the gardens, through the October darkness. Then, in the early hours of the 6th of October, something went wrong. A group of the crowd accounts differ on the size, and their precise intentions broke into the palace, found their way toward the Queen's apartments, and killed 2 of the royal bodyguards in the corridors. Marie Antoinette, awakened by the noise, fled through a connecting passage to the king's rooms just ahead of the crowd reaching her chamber. The palace, for a few chaotic minutes, was genuinely out of control. Lafayette managed to restore some order. He appeared on a palace balcony with the royal family, Louis, Marie Antoinette, and their children, and the crowd below, which had been calling for the Queen's blood minutes earlier, shifted when Lafayette took Marie Antoinette's hand and kissed it in a gesture of protective loyalty. The crowd's mood, volatile as it had been all morning, turned again. Shouts of "Vive la Reine" rose from some in the crowd, though not from all, and the goodwill was clearly conditional and temporary. What the crowd wanted, and what they made clear through the morning, was the royal family in Paris. Louis agreed. The decision may have felt, to him, like one more concession under pressure, which it was, but it was also one that carried enormous practical consequences for everything that followed. On the afternoon of the 6th of October, the royal family left Versailles. They travelled in a carriage surrounded by the National Guard, and the procession that accompanied them back to Paris was unlike anything the city had seen. The crowd of marchers, now heading home, surrounded the royal carriages, with women riding on the cannon that had been dragged to Versailles the day before, carrying loaves of bread on the ends of pikes alongside the severed heads of the 2 bodyguards killed that morning. It was a procession that was simultaneously triumphant and grotesque, celebratory and threatening, and it captured something essential about the revolution's character. In this period, its mixture of genuine popular energy, practical political logic, and violence that existed just below the surface of every major event. The royal family was installed in the Tuileries Palace in central Paris, a building that had not served as a royal residence for some time, and that was not, by Versailles standards, particularly comfortable. Louis reportedly looked around his new quarters and remarked that everything was very fine. He was not being sincere. The Tuileries was a cage with good furniture, and everyone, including Louis, understood that. The National Assembly followed the king to Paris, relocating from Versailles and taking up residence in a converted riding hall near the Tuileries. This move was significant in ways that went beyond the practical. Versailles had been, for over a century, the physical centre of French royal power, the place where the court performed itself, where the king was surrounded by the rituals and architecture of absolute monarchy. Paris was something entirely different. Paris had coffee houses and newspapers and political clubs and crowds. Paris had the Palais Royal, which had become the nerve centre of radical political opinion, and the Cordeliers district, where a lawyer named Georges Danton was building a reputation as a voice of the radical popular movement. Paris had the women who had marched to Versailles and brought the king back. The move to Paris changed the revolution's centre of gravity in a way that became permanent. The political clubs that had been forming since the summer, the Jacobin Club most prominently, which had started as the Society of the Friends of the Constitution and would grow into one of the most powerful political organisations in French history, were Parisian institutions. The radical press that was beginning to shape public opinion, Jean-Paul Marat's newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, among others, was a Parisian institution. The sections, the neighbourhood assemblies that would become increasingly important as the revolution radicalised, were Parisian institutions. The king was now surrounded by all of these things, at close range, with no Versailles distance to provide insulation. The October days, as the march and its aftermath came to be known, marked a decisive shift in the revolution's internal geography. Power had moved to Paris in a physical and institutional sense, and it would not move back. The question going forward was not whether the revolution would continue, it would, but in which direction, and at whose direction, and how far it was willing to go. The constitutional monarchy that the more moderate members of the National Assembly still hoped to construct required a king who genuinely accepted his reduced role, who understood that the revolution had permanently altered the relationship between the crown and the nation, and who could operate within those new limits with something approaching good faith. Whether Louis XVI was capable of that, whether he even believed it was legitimate to expect it of him, was the question that everything else now turned on. He was in Paris. He was watched. He was constitutionally committed to a process he had never chosen. And in the Tuileries Palace, surrounded by a city that had just demonstrated in the most unmistakable terms what it was willing to do, he was already thinking about his options. The constitutional monarchy and its slow collapse. The months that followed the October days had a deceptive quality of normalcy about them. The National Assembly was working. The king was in Paris. The immediate crisis of the summer, the bread panic, the rural uprisings, the military confrontation around the capital had settled into something that looked, from a certain angle, like the beginning of an orderly transition. France was going to become a constitutional monarchy. The king would reign but not rule in the absolute sense. A legislature would represent the nation. The law would apply equally. The Declaration of the Rights of Man had said so in writing, and the Assembly was now engaged in the detailed, complicated work of translating those principles into an actual functioning government. It was painstaking work. The Assembly debated endlessly about the structure of the legislature, about who would have the right to vote, about what powers the king would retain, about the organisation of the courts, about the administrative divisions of the country. France was reorganised geographically into 83 departments, replacing the old patchwork of provinces with a rational grid designed to eliminate regional privilege and bring uniform administration to the entire country. The old parliaments, those conservative regional judicial bodies that had blocked reform for decades, were abolished. A new judicial system was designed from scratch. The guilds that had regulated urban trades for centuries were dismantled. The metric system was under development, bringing the same rationalising impulse to weights and measures that the revolution was applying to everything else. The Church presented the most immediately explosive problem. The Catholic Church in France controlled enormous wealth, land, buildings, income, and the revolutionary government needed money badly. The solution the Assembly arrived at was radical. In November of 1789, church property was nationalised. The state would take ownership of church lands and use them as backing for a new paper currency called the assignat. The clergy would become, in effect, salaried employees of the state rather than an independent institution with its own financial base. This might have been managed without catastrophic consequences if it had stopped there. It did not. In July of 1790, the Assembly passed the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, a law that restructured the Catholic Church in France along the lines of a state administrative department. Bishops and priests would be elected by their congregations rather than appointed through Rome. The Pope's authority over the French Church was effectively severed. And then, in November of 1790, the Assembly required all clergy to swear an oath of loyalty to the new constitutional order. This oath produced an immediate and lasting fracture. Roughly half of the French clergy, the non-juring priests, as they came to be called, refused to take it, on the grounds that they could not swear loyalty to an arrangement that the Pope had condemned and that contradicted their understanding of where religious authority actually resided. The other half took the oath and continued their functions under the new arrangement. The result was a split that ran through French Catholicism and through French communities, a juring priest in one parish, a non-juring priest in the next, with devout Catholics often refusing to attend Mass celebrated by clergy who had sworn what they considered an illegitimate oath. The Revolution had, in attempting to rationalise the Church, managed to alienate a significant portion of the French population whose religious identity was central to their sense of who they were. Outside France, the Revolution was being watched with a mixture of fascination and growing alarm. The liberal nobility and educated professional classes of Britain, the German states, and elsewhere had initially greeted the French experiment with some sympathy. Here was the world's most powerful monarchy, acknowledging the principles of constitutional government and natural rights, which seemed like progress. Edmund Burke, the British political philosopher who would become the Revolution's most articulate critic, published his Reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790, a sustained argument that the Revolution was not the orderly reform its supporters claimed, but a reckless destruction of the accumulated wisdom embedded in traditional institutions, driven by abstract theory that ignored the complexity of actual human societies. Burke was answered by Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, published in 1791, which defended the Revolution's principles vigorously and pointed out that Burke seemed more moved by the plight of the court than by the suffering of the millions the old order had ground down for generations. The argument between Burke and Paine was, at its core, the argument about the revolution that would occupy political thought for generations afterward. Within France, the political landscape was fracturing in ways that the constitutional machinery being constructed was not well designed to manage. The Jacobin Club, formerly the Society of the Friends of the Constitution, had branches across France and was becoming a genuinely national political organisation, with a membership that ranged from moderate constitutional reformers to increasingly radical voices. The Cordeliers Club, based in Paris, occupied a more consistently radical position and counted among its members Georges Danton, whose physical presence and thunderous oratory made him a powerful figure in the city's political life, and Jean-Paul Marat, whose newspaper L'Ami du Peuple sustained a relentless drumbeat of suspicion toward the king, the aristocracy, and anyone Marat considered insufficiently committed to the popular cause. The press had exploded. Before 1789, the French press operated under significant royal censorship, and the number of newspapers was limited. By 1790, hundreds of newspapers were being published, representing every conceivable political position. They were read aloud in coffee houses, posted in public places, passed between neighbours in working-class districts where not everyone could read fluently, but where someone who could would read to those who could not. The sheer volume of political information and opinion circulating through Paris and through the provincial cities created a public conversation of an intensity and reach that France had never experienced before. It also created a rumour ecosystem of considerable power, where stories that were partially true, entirely invented, or somewhere in between, could reach large audiences before anyone had an opportunity to correct them. The king moved through this world with a combination of surface compliance and private resistance that was not as well concealed as he believed. Louis had accepted the constitutional framework because he had no practical choice. He had signed what he was asked to sign and appeared in public when appearances were required. But in his private correspondence, including letters carried through channels he believed to be secure, he was communicating a very different position. He was in contact with his wife's family in Austria, with emigrated nobles who had left France in the months following the Bastille and were gathering in the German territories to the east, and with other European monarchs who shared an interest in the revolution's failure. He was not, in any meaningful sense, the constitutional monarch he was publicly performing. He was a king waiting, with what patience he could manage, for circumstances to change in his favour. The émigrés, the nobles and clergy who had fled France, many of them immediately after the events of July and October 1789, were organising abroad. The king's own brothers, the Comte de Provence and the Comte d'Artois, were among them, and they were encouraging foreign powers to intervene militarily in France to restore the old order. The courts of Austria and Prussia were listening with increasing interest. The revolution in France was not simply a French domestic matter. It was, from the perspective of the crowned heads of Europe, a contagious disease that threatened the legitimacy of every throne on the continent, and there were serious conversations about whether and how to contain it. Within the Assembly, the political groupings that would eventually become the revolution's defining factions were taking shape. On one side were the constitutional monarchists, men like Antoine Barnave, Adrien Duport, and Alexandre de Lameth, who believed that the revolution had achieved its proper goals and should now stabilise around the constitutional framework being built. On the other side were those who believed the revolution had further to go, that the king could not be trusted, that privilege had not been fully dismantled, that the promises of the Declaration of the Rights of Man remained unfulfilled for the majority of French people, and in the galleries above the assembly floor, crowds of Parisian citizens watched the debates and made their own opinions known through applause, jeering, and the kind of sustained pressure that made even moderately sympathetic deputies aware of what the city expected from them. The constitution that the assembly was building was, in its formal structure, a reasonable attempt to create a workable constitutional monarchy on Enlightenment principles. It gave the legislature genuine authority, established an independent judiciary, created the administrative structure of the departments, and provided for freedom of expression and equality before the law. It gave the king a suspensive veto, the ability to delay legislation he opposed, but not an absolute veto, meaning he could slow things down but not permanently block them. It was, on paper, a system that could have functioned if the man at its centre had genuinely accepted it. By the summer of 1791, with the constitution nearing completion, the evidence that Louis had not genuinely accepted it was accumulating in ways that were difficult to ignore. He had been seen to weep at the departure of non-juring priests from Paris. He had received communion from a non-juring priest at Easter, in public, in a gesture that could only be read as a repudiation of the civil constitution of the clergy. His correspondence with foreign powers, while not yet publicly known in its full extent, was suspected by enough people in enough places to fuel the persistent narrative that the king was playing a double game, performing constitutional loyalty while working privately toward a restoration of the old order. The constitutional monarchy of 1790 and 1791 was not a failed idea in the abstract. It failed for reasons that were specific and personal and political, because the king at its centre never believed in it, because the émigrés were actively working against it from abroad, because the church policy had created a large body of alienated Catholic opinion, and because the radical political culture developing in Paris was pushing the revolution in directions that made the moderate centre progressively harder to hold. By the spring of 1791, the constitutional experiment was still standing, but it was standing on ground that was shifting beneath it, and the man who was supposed to be its guarantor was already planning his departure. The flight to Varennes and the point of no return. The plan had been months in the making, Louis XVI, King of France, constitutional monarch by compulsion and prisoner by circumstance, had been thinking about leaving Paris since at least the autumn of 1790. The idea was not, in its basic form, unreasonable from his perspective. He was a king who believed his authority came from God, who had been forced into a constitutional arrangement he considered illegitimate, who was surrounded in Paris by a hostile political culture and a press that depicted him as either a fool or a traitor, and whose family's physical safety had been demonstrated, on the night of the 6th of October, to be genuinely precarious. Getting out of Paris, reaching the eastern frontier where loyal royalist troops under the command of General François-Claude de Bouillé were positioned, and then negotiating from a position of military strength rather than captivity. This was the logic of the escape plan, and it was not without a certain internal coherence. What it lacked, in almost every particular, was competent execution. The escape was organised with a level of logistical detail that reflected the court's habits more than its circumstances. Marie Antoinette had been the primary organiser on the royal side, working with a Swedish count named Axel von Fersen, who was devoted to the Queen with a loyalty that contemporaries noted, and later historians have discussed at considerable length to arrange the practical mechanics of the Prus. A flight. A specially built Berline carriage had been constructed large, heavy, well appointed, capable of carrying the royal family in reasonable comfort over a long journey. The plan was to travel in disguise, with the royal family posing as the household of a fictional Russian noblewoman named Madame de Korff. Louis would travel as her steward. Marie Antoinette would be the governess. The royal children would be presented as the noblewoman's daughters. Fresh horses would be waiting at relay stations along the route to the eastern frontier. On the night of the 20th of June, 1791, the royal family slipped out of the Tuileries Palace. The escape itself began badly. Louis, in leaving the palace, took a wrong turn in the dark courtyard and lost significant time finding the right exit. The carriage that was supposed to be waiting in a specific location had moved slightly, causing further delay. By the time the family was actually in the Berline and moving through the dark streets of Paris, they were already behind schedule, and the schedule mattered, because relay stations with fresh horses and military escorts had been arranged for specific times, and the margin for error was not generous. The carriage moved through the night and into the following day, heading northeast toward the town of Varennes. The royal family was not, it turned out, as well disguised as they had hoped. Louis XVI was one of the most recognisable faces in France. His portrait appeared on the currency. At several stops along the route, people looked at the large, heavy-featured man travelling as a steward and thought they recognised him. One postmaster, named Jean-Baptiste Drouet, at the town of Saint-Menehould, compared the face of the man in the carriage to the king's image on an assignat note he had in his pocket, became convinced they matched, and rode ahead to raise the alarm. At Varennes, a small town that had the misfortune of sitting directly on the royal family's route to safety, Drouet reached the local authorities ahead of the carriage. A grocer named Sauce, who also served as the local procurator, a kind of municipal official, was informed. When the royal Berline arrived at Varennes in the late evening of the 21st of June, it was stopped. Louis initially attempted to maintain the pretense of his identity. The effort did not last long. Local officials who had seen the king before recognised him. A retired soldier in the crowd identified Marie Antoinette. The disguise collapsed. What followed was a night of awkward standoffs, local deliberation, and the arrival of messengers and officials from Paris, as news of the stop travelled back toward the capital. The National Assembly, awakened to the news that the king had fled, reacted with a combination of alarm and immediate practical response. Decrees went out in multiple directions simultaneously. The flight of the royal family was not to be described as a flight. It was to be understood as an abduction. The fiction that the king had been taken against his will was the only framing that allowed the constitutional monarchy to survive at all, since a king who had voluntarily fled his constitutional post had rather clearly indicated his opinion of that post. In Varennes, Louis made one final attempt at authority. He produced a document, a formal declaration he had prepared before leaving Paris, setting out his objections to the constitutional arrangements that had been imposed upon him and his reasons for departing. It was, in its way, a coherent statement of his actual position. He objected to the erosion of royal prerogative. He objected to the civil constitution of the clergy. He objected to the way the constitution had been constructed without his genuine participation. He was not wrong that he had been manoeuvred and pressured into agreements he had never freely chosen. None of this helped him in Varennes. The document was noted, and the family was told they would be returning to Paris. The journey back was one of the most extraordinary scenes of the entire revolution. The royal family travelled in their berline through summer heat, surrounded by a crowd that swelled as the carriage moved through each successive town. The National Assembly had sent 3 commissioners to accompany them: Barnave, Pession, and Latour-Maubourg. Barnave, a moderate constitutional monarchist, shared the carriage with the royal family for much of the return journey, sitting across from Marie Antoinette and Louis, with the royal children between them. By several accounts, Barnave and the Queen had genuine conversations during this strange, suspended journey, and the experience of proximity to the actual human beings behind the revolutionary caricatures affected him. He left the journey more sympathetic to the Queen than he had arrived. It did not, in the end, save any of them. Along the route back to Paris, crowds gathered in silence. A decree from the National Assembly had ordered that no one show any sign of respect to the king. No hat removed, no bow, no cry of "Vive le Roi." The silence was, in its way, more unsettling than hostility. In some towns the crowd was openly hostile. In others it simply watched. The carriage moved through all of it, slow and exposed, with the royal family visible through the windows, the pretense of their disguise entirely abandoned. Louis had left Paris as a king performing constitutional compliance. He returned as something much harder to define, a man whose own actions had made the constitutional fiction impossible to sustain. The political consequences in Paris were immediate and lasting. The National Assembly, committed to the fiction of abduction, reinstated Louis formally, suspended him briefly while the situation was assessed, then restored his functions under the constitution that was nearly complete. But the political damage was irreparable in a way that formal reinstatement could not address. The men and women of Paris who had extended some degree of trust to the constitutional monarchy, who had accepted the idea that Louis might genuinely work within the new framework, had that trust destroyed in a specific, visible, humiliating way. He had tried to run. He had been caught at a small town on the road to the Austrian frontier. Whatever remained of the relationship between the French people and their king had been fundamentally altered. The radical clubs and newspapers that had already been pushing for a republic found their position transformed overnight. Before Varennes, calling for the abolition of the monarchy was a fringe position that most of the National Assembly considered dangerous and premature. After Varennes, it was a mainstream conversation. The Cordeliers Club circulated a petition calling for the king's deposition. On the 17th of July, 1791, a large crowd gathered at the Champ de Mars, the broad field on the left bank of the Seine, to sign the petition. The National Guard, under Lafayette's command, was sent to disperse them. In the confrontation that followed, the Guard fired on the crowd, killing somewhere between 12 and 50 people. The precise number has never been definitively established. The Champ de Mars massacre, as it came to be called, drove a wedge between the moderate constitutional wing of the revolution and the popular radical movement that would take years to close, and in some respects never did close at all. The constitution was completed and formally adopted in September of 1791. Louis accepted it, swore his oath to it in the Assembly, with what observers described as reasonable composure, and the constitutional monarchy was officially, formally, in operation. A new legislature, the Legislative Assembly, replaced the National Assembly. The members of the National Assembly had voted somewhat quixotically, that none of them could serve in the new body, a self-denying ordinance that cleared out the experienced moderate politicians who had built the constitutional framework and replaced them with a fresh cohort of younger, less experienced deputies, many of them considerably more radical than their predecessors. Europe was watching. The Declaration of Pillnitz, issued jointly by Austria and Prussia in August of 1791, had declared the situation of the French king a matter of common interest to all European sovereigns, a statement carefully worded to avoid being an outright declaration of war, but clearly intended as a warning and an encouragement to French émigrés that external support might eventually materialise. The crowned heads of Europe were not going to watch the French experiment indefinitely without response. Louis, in his Tuileries rooms, had sworn his oath to the Constitution. He had also written, in a private letter sent through secure channels shortly after swearing it, that he did not consider himself bound by what he had been compelled to accept under duress. He was, by this point, committed to a double existence so thoroughly that it is difficult to know whether he experienced it as hypocrisy or simply as the necessary behaviour of a man in an impossible situation. Perhaps, in his own understanding, both were true. The Constitution was in place, the king had sworn to uphold it, and France was moving, with gathering speed, toward a confrontation that the constitutional framework had been built to prevent and was not strong enough to contain: war, the Commune, and the fall of the monarchy. The Legislative Assembly that convened in October of 1791 was a different body from the one that had preceded it. The National Assembly had contained men who had lived through the entire arc from the Estates General to the Constitution, who carried in their memory the tennis court oath, the August decrees, the October days, and the long, complicated work of building a new legal order from materials that had never been used in quite this combination before. The Legislative Assembly was populated largely by men who had not been part of any of that. They were younger, less experienced in the specific negotiations of revolutionary politics, and in many cases more ideologically committed to positions that left less room for the kinds of compromise that constitutional governance requires. Among the most influential grouping in the new assembly were the Girondins, a loose faction named for the Gironde department in southwestern France, from which several of its leading figures came, though their actual membership was spread more broadly. The Girondins were eloquent, educated, genuinely committed to republican principles in the abstract, and possessed of a confidence in their own judgment that sometimes outran their political instincts. Their most prominent voices included Jacques-Pierre Brissot, a journalist and political activist who had been agitating for reform since before the Revolution, and Pierre Victurnien Vergniaud, whose oratory was considered among the finest in the Assembly. The Girondins would play a central role in one of the most consequential decisions the Legislative Assembly made: the push toward war with the European powers. The argument for war was not straightforwardly unreasonable on its own terms. The émigrés gathering in the German territories, particularly at Koblenz, where the king's brothers were coordinating with sympathetic foreign courts, represented a real threat. The Declaration of Pillnitz had signalled that Austria and Prussia were watching French events with hostile intent. The French frontier was ringed with potential enemies, and there was a political logic to war that appealed to different factions for different reasons. The Girondins believed that a war against the monarchies of Europe would force the revolution to clarify itself, would expose those who were genuinely committed to its principles, and flush out those who were secretly working against it. They believed France would win, and that winning would spread revolutionary ideals across Europe. Louis, remarkably, also wanted war, but for the opposite reason. A French military defeat, he calculated privately, would restore his position. The European powers would intervene, suppress the revolution, and return the monarchy to its proper authority. He and Marie Antoinette were sending intelligence to Vienna about French military dispositions and capabilities, an act that, had it been fully known at the time, would have destroyed whatever remained of their political position immediately. It was not fully known, but it was suspected by enough people to fuel the narrative of royal treachery that was already circulating through the radical press. War was declared on Austria on the 20th of April, 1792. The campaign began disastrously. French forces, whose officer corps had been gutted by the emigration of noble officers who wanted nothing to do with the Revolutionary Army, performed poorly in the opening engagements. Units broke and fled. Commanders lost control of their men. In one incident, a French general was killed by his own retreating soldiers. The early weeks of the war suggested, with uncomfortable clarity, that the Revolutionary Army was not yet the force that revolutionary rhetoric had assumed it would be. The military failures intensified the atmosphere of suspicion in Paris. If France was losing, someone must be responsible. The radical press, Marat's l'ami du peuple foremost among them, pointed at the obvious target: the court. The Tuileries was referred to as the Austrian Committee, the implication being that the king and queen were actively working to undermine the French war effort in coordination with the enemy. The term was not simply rhetorical. It reflected a suspicion that was substantially correct, even if the details being circulated were sometimes exaggerated. The summer of 1792 brought both military crisis and political escalation in rapid succession. Prussia joined the war in July. The combined Austrian and Prussian forces under the Duke of Brunswick began moving toward the French frontier. On the 25th of July, Brunswick issued a manifesto almost certainly drafted with significant input from French émigrés that threatened Paris with military execution and the destruction of the city if any harm came to the royal family. The manifesto was intended to intimidate. Its actual effect was to confirm, in the minds of radical Parisians, everything they had believed about the connection between the court and the foreign enemy. If the commander of the invading army was issuing personal guarantees for the safety of the French king, the conclusion about where Louis's loyalties lay seemed obvious. The sections of Paris, the neighbourhood assemblies that had been growing steadily more assertive as the political temperature climbed, began meeting in permanent session through July. The sans-culottes, the working-class radical movement, whose name referenced the long trousers they wore rather than the knee breeches of the bourgeoisie and above, were organising in ways that went beyond the formal structures of the Legislative Assembly. 47 of the 48 sections of Paris voted to demand the king's deposition. The Legislative Assembly hesitated, it debated, it did not act, and in that hesitation, the sections decided to act themselves. The night of the 9th of August and the early morning of the 10th was one of the most significant in the revolution's history. The insurrectionary commune, a new radical municipal government that had effectively seized control of the Paris city administration during the night, sent the tocsin ringing from the churches across the city. Armed men from the sections, along with battalions of Fédérés volunteers who had come to Paris from the provinces for a patriotic festival and had stayed, began moving toward the Tuileries Palace. Louis was awake. He reviewed the forces available to defend the palace: roughly 900 Swiss guards, several hundred gentlemen volunteers, and a contingent of the National Guard whose reliability was, by this point, deeply uncertain. He walked among them in the early morning, reportedly pale and visibly distressed, reviewing troops who were defending a position they did not believe was defensible. At some point in the early hours of the 10th of August, on the advice of those around him, Louis made the decision to take his family and seek refuge with the Legislative Assembly, which was meeting nearby. He crossed the garden of the Tuileries with Marie Antoinette, their children, and a small group of attendants, and presented himself to the Assembly. The Legislative Assembly was not constitutionally equipped to know what to do with a king who had just arrived on their doorstep asking for protection. They placed the royal family in the reporter's box, a small, cramped space where journalists normally sat to record debates, and proceeded to try to conduct business while the sounds of battle from the direction of the Tuileries told them that the situation outside was already beyond negotiation. At the palace, what had begun as a confrontation became a massacre. After the king's departure, the Swiss guards received confused and contradictory orders. Louis, from the assembly, sent a written order for the Swiss to cease fire and withdraw. The order arrived in the middle of an ongoing battle. Some say it arrived after firing had already begun in earnest. Others that the timing was unclear. Whatever the precise sequence, the outcome was catastrophic for the Swiss. They were professional soldiers, disciplined and loyal, but they were defending a palace whose king had already left, against a force that vastly outnumbered them. Around 600 of the approximately 900 Swiss guards were killed, some in the battle itself, others captured and killed afterward by the crowd. The Tuileries was sacked. The palace that had been the royal family's Parisian home since the October days was stripped and damaged in hours. The Legislative Assembly, sitting with the former king in its reporter's box, suspended Louis from his functions. They voted to convene a new body, a national convention, to be elected by universal male suffrage rather than the property-qualified franchise of the Legislative Assembly, which would determine the future form of the French government. The constitutional monarchy was over. Louis XVI was no longer a constitutional king. He was, in the careful language the Assembly used for the moment, a citizen awaiting the judgment of the nation. He was moved with his family to the Temple, a medieval fortress in central Paris that served as a reasonably secure prison, and the revolutionary government began the process of deciding what to do with him. The fall of the monarchy on the 10th of August, 1792 produced immediate practical consequences that reordered the entire political landscape. Lafayette, commanding French forces on the northern frontier, refused to accept the insurrection's authority and attempted to march his troops back to Paris to restore order. His soldiers declined to follow him. He crossed the frontier and surrendered to the Austrians who imprisoned him. Since a French general who had helped build the American Republic and then the French constitutional monarchy was not exactly a natural ally of the conservative European powers either, he would spend years in an Austrian prison before Napoleon eventually negotiated his release. It was an ignoble end to a career that had begun with such idealistic promise. In Paris, the insurrectionary commune consolidated its control over the city. The radical political culture that had been building since 1789 was now, effectively, in charge of the capital, and through the capital, of much of the revolution's direction. The Legislative Assembly, politically weakened and constitutionally undermined, limped forward through August while the elections for the National Convention took place. The Prussian army continued its advance into French territory. The fortress of Verdun fell in early September. The road to Paris was, in principle, open. France was at war, without a king, with the enemy advancing, and with a political situation in Paris that had moved beyond anything the moderate reformers of 1789 had imagined when they had locked themselves in a tennis court and sworn to give their country a constitution. The revolution had not arrived where any of them had planned to take it. And in the first days of September, it was about to demonstrate, in the most brutal possible terms, what happens when a city convinced of imminent military catastrophe turns its fear inward. The Reign of Terror Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. The September massacres began on the 2nd of September, 1792, and lasted approximately 5 days. The immediate trigger was the fall of Verdun and the genuine, well-founded fear that the Prussian army would reach Paris within weeks. The city was in a state of controlled panic. Thousands of men were being called up to march to the front. And in that atmosphere, a rumour not entirely without historical precedent, but without specific evidence in this case, spread through the sections and the radical clubs, that the prisoners held in Paris's jails, many of them non-juring priests, political suspects, and common criminals, were planning a counter-revolutionary uprising from inside the prisons, while the city's defenders were away at the front. The city, the story went, would be stabbed from within while it was being attacked from without. The crowds that entered the prisons acted with a terrible efficiency. Makeshift tribunals were set up inside the prison gates, mock trials that lasted minutes, in which prisoners were dragged before a panel of men who asked a question or two and then gestured left toward release or right toward the courtyard where the killing was happening. Across 6 prisons over 5 days, somewhere between 1,100 and 1,400 people were killed. The majority were common criminals who had nothing to do with counter-revolution. Around 220 were non-juring priests. A smaller number were genuine political prisoners of various kinds. The Princess de Lamballe, a close friend of Marie Antoinette, was among those killed. Her head was subsequently paraded on a pike beneath the windows of the temple where the royal family was imprisoned, in a deliberate act of psychological cruelty whose full horror requires no embellishment. The National Convention that assembled on the 20th of September, 1792, did so in the shadow of the massacres. It was elected by universal male suffrage, the broadest franchise France had yet used, though actual voter turnout was low, partly because the violence of early September had not created an atmosphere conducive to calm civic participation. The convention's first act was to abolish the monarchy formally and declare France a republic. The vote was unanimous. The French Republic was one and indivisible. The revolutionary calendar was introduced, dating year 1 from the 22nd of September, 1792, the day the Republic was proclaimed, in a gesture that made explicit the revolution's ambition to remake not just government, but time itself. Within the convention, the political fault lines that had been developing through the Legislative Assembly deepened into outright factional warfare. The Girondins, sitting on the right side of the hall, remained committed to their vision of a moderate, law-governed republic with significant autonomy for the provinces. The Montagnards the Mountain, so called because they sat on the elevated left benches of the hall, were the radical faction, centred on the Jacobin Club and drawing their political energy increasingly from the sans-culotte movement of Paris. Between them sat the Plain, the large, politically flexible centre, whose votes determined outcomes and whose members spent much of the convention's existence trying to navigate between two increasingly irreconcilable poles. The most prominent figure among the Montagnards, and the man whose name would become permanently attached to the period that followed, was Maximilien Robespierre. He was 34 years old in 1792, a lawyer from Arras in northern France, and he had been a consistent presence in revolutionary politics since the Estates General. He was not physically imposing, slight, carefully dressed, precise in his manners and his speech. He wore powder in his hair long after it had gone out of fashion, which told you something about his relationship with changing circumstances. He had earned the nickname the Incorruptible through years of living simply, refusing bribes, and maintaining the same publicly stated principles regardless of which direction political winds were blowing. In an era when consistency was genuinely rare, this had made him a figure of considerable trust among the Jacobin rank and file, and among the sans-culottes of Paris. Robespierre's political thinking drew heavily from Rousseau, the general will, the idea that the virtuous republic required virtuous citizens, the belief that private interest was the enemy of public good. He was not cynical in the way that some of his contemporaries were. He genuinely believed the things he said, which made him in some respects more dangerous than someone who was merely ambitious. A politician who says things he does not believe can be negotiated with, because his actual interests can be identified and addressed. A politician who is entirely sincere in the conviction that his opponents are enemies of the people, and that the Republic's survival requires their elimination, is a different kind of problem. The trial of Louis XVI began in December of 1792. The king was brought before the convention, questioned about the contents of an iron safe discovered hidden in the Tuileries walls, a cache of documents that revealed, in considerable detail, his secret correspondence with émigrés and foreign powers. While he had been publicly performing constitutional loyalty, Louis answered questions carefully and denied what he could. The evidence was difficult to argue with. The trial was, in its formal proceedings, reasonably conducted by the standards the convention set for itself. The verdict was never seriously in doubt. On the 16th of January, 1793, the convention voted on the king's guilt. The result was unanimous, 387 votes to none, with the remainder abstaining or absent. On the question of the death penalty, the vote was closer but decisive, 361 for death, with 360 voting for some form of imprisonment or exile. The margin was thin enough that individual votes mattered, including that of the Duke of Orleans, Louis's cousin, who had renamed himself Philippe Égalité and voted for the death of his own kinsman in a gesture of revolutionary commitment that did not, as it turned out, protect him from the guillotine himself when his turn came. Louis XVI was executed on the 21st of January, 1793, on the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde in Paris. He was 38 years old. By the accounts of those present, he died with composure and attempted to address the crowd, saying that he died innocent of the crimes attributed to him and forgiving those responsible for his death. The drums drowned out his words before he finished. The blade fell. A young man dipped his hand in the blood and sprinkled it on the crowd. The execution of a king was still, in 1793, sufficiently unprecedented that the crowd's reaction mixed genuine shock with the release of tension that had been building for years. The Republic was now committed. There was no constitutional monarchy to return to, no figure of royal legitimacy around whom a conservative restoration could organise inside France. The war with Europe escalated dramatically in the weeks following the execution. Britain, the Netherlands, and Spain joined Austria and Prussia in the coalition against France, and simultaneously a revolt broke out in the Vendée region of western France, where resistance to conscription, the civil constitution of the clergy, and the execution of the king combined into a genuinely serious counter-revolutionary uprising that would occupy French military resources for years. The crisis of the spring of 1793 produced the institutional response that defined the terror. In April, the Committee of Public Safety was created, a smaller executive body drawn from the convention that could act with the speed and decisiveness that the full convention could not manage. Initially moderate in its composition, the committee was transformed in July of 1793 when Robespierre joined it, followed by other committed Montagnards including Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, 25 years old, strikingly handsome, and possessed of a political rigidity that made even Robespierre seem flexible by comparison, and Lazare Carnot, a military engineer of genuine talent who took charge of organising the French war effort with a systematic competence that would eventually turn the military situation around. The Committee of Public Safety, operating alongside the Committee of General Security, which handled internal policing, became effectively the executive government of France through the terror-making decisions, issuing orders and operating with a speed and authority that bypassed the slower deliberative processes of the convention. The law of suspects, passed in September of 1793, broadened the definition of who could be arrested to an extent that made virtually anyone a potential target. Suspects included not just people who had done something counter-revolutionary, but people who by their conduct, connections, words, or writings had shown themselves to be supporters of tyranny, a category elastic enough to encompass almost anyone the committee decided to include. The Revolutionary Tribunal, established in March of 1793, was the instrument through which the terror operated its machinery of prosecution. It heard cases rapidly, with limited opportunity for defence, and its verdicts were final. There was no appeal. The guillotine, which had been adopted as the Republic's instrument of execution on the grounds that it was swift, efficient, and democratic in applying the same method to all regardless of rank, was by the autumn of 1793 working at a pace that its inventor had not imagined when he had recommended it as a humane alternative to the varied and sometimes prolonged methods of execution that had preceded it. It was democratic in a sense he had perhaps not intended. Robespierre articulated the logic of the terror in a speech to the convention in February of 1794 that has remained one of the most quoted and most chilling documents of the period. The government of the revolution, he argued, was the despotism of liberty against tyranny, Virtue without terror was powerless. Terror without virtue was corrupt. The Republic required both, applied together, to survive the enemies that surrounded it. It was a formulation that sounded, in its abstract structure, like a coherent political philosophy. In practice, it was a justification for unlimited state violence against anyone. The committee decided to identify as an enemy, and the category of enemy had been expanding steadily since the summer of 1793, with no visible mechanism for contraction. The terror was not random, though it sometimes appeared so from within. It had a logic, the logic of a government convinced that it was surrounded by enemies, that those enemies were capable of disguise and infiltration, and that the cost of failing to identify and eliminate them was the destruction of everything the revolution had built. That logic led, step by step, to a place where the question was not whether someone had done something, but whether they might, under the right circumstances, become dangerous. And a system designed to answer that question will, inevitably, expand without limit. Because the answer can always be yes, for anyone, given a sufficiently creative reading of their history, their associations, and their words. By the winter of 1793 to 94, the Committee of Public Safety was governing a country at war on multiple frontiers, suppressing internal rebellion in the Vendée and in the federalist cities that had risen against Montagnard dominance, managing an economy under severe strain, and simultaneously prosecuting a domestic political terror that was consuming not just obvious enemies of the Republic, but increasing numbers of people who had been, until recently, among its most committed defenders. The revolution was eating. The only question remaining was how far it would go before something stopped it, and whether whatever stopped it would do so before there was nothing left worth saving. The human cost victims, trials, and the death of the Queen. To understand the terror as a lived experience rather than a political abstraction, it helps to move away from the Committee of Public Safety and the convention floor and into the streets, the courtrooms, and the prisons where ordinary French men and women encountered it directly. The guillotine on the Place de la Révolution was the most visible instrument of revolutionary justice, but the machinery that fed it was far larger and more pervasive than any single execution ground. It ran through a network of revolutionary tribunals, surveillance committees, informers, denunciations, and prison cells that touched the lives of hundreds of thousands of French people who never appeared before the blade themselves, but who lived through 1793 and into 1794 in a state of chronic anxiety about whether they might. The prisons of Paris filled steadily through the autumn of 1793. The Luxembourg, the Conciergerie, the Abbaye, the Port Libre buildings that had not been designed as prisons or had not been designed for anything like the numbers they now held, were packed with people awaiting trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The population of these prisons was remarkably varied. Former nobles sat alongside priests, alongside merchants accused of economic crimes, alongside Girondin sympathizers, alongside ordinary citizens whose neighbours had filed denunciations against them for remarks made in a moment of frustration, or for associations with people who had subsequently been arrested. The law of suspects had cast a wide net, and the net did not discriminate carefully. Prison life in this period had its own strange texture. Accounts left by survivors describe communities forming within the walls, people who had nothing in common outside, finding themselves thrown together in circumstances that stripped away the social markers that had previously defined. Their interactions. Former aristocrats and working-class prisoners shared the same cramped spaces. People played cards, wrote letters, maintained whatever routines they could construct in confinement, and waited. The waiting was its own particular form of suffering, not knowing when one's name would be called, watching others leave for trial and not return, performing a kind of forced normalcy in the face of genuine terror. Some prisoners formed deep friendships in these conditions. Some fell in love. The Conciergerie, which served as the antechamber to the guillotine for most of its prominent prisoners, became so associated with imminent death that being transferred there from another prison was understood as a signal that one's trial was imminent. The Girondin deputies who had opposed the Montagnards in the Convention met their end in the autumn of 1793. 21 of their number were tried before the Revolutionary Tribunal in late October. The trial lasted several days longer than most because the Girondins included some of the finest orators in France, and men like Vergniaud were not going to be silenced without using whatever platform remained to them. Vergniaud spoke at length in his own defence. It did not change the outcome. All 21 were convicted. They were executed on the 31st of October, 1793, on the Place de la Révolution, and accounts of the execution describe them singing the Marseillaise as they waited a gesture of defiant identification with the revolution that was killing them, which was either deeply moving or deeply ironic depending on one's perspective, and was perhaps both simultaneously. Marie Antoinette had been separated from her children and moved to the Conciergerie in August of 1793. Her son, the 8-year-old Louis Charles, who was, in the eyes of royalists across Europe, Louis XVII, had been taken from her in July and placed in the custody of a cobbler named Antoine Simon, who was tasked with giving the boy a properly republican education. The separation was deliberately cruel, and Marie Antoinette's reaction to it was described by witnesses as one of the few moments during her long imprisonment when her composure genuinely broke. She had maintained a remarkable self-control through everything: the October days, the flight to Varennes, the fall of the Tuileries, the imprisonment in the Temple, the death of her husband. Losing her son unmade her in a way that nothing else had. The Conciergerie was a damp, cold building on the Île de la Cité, and the cell allocated to the former queen was small and poorly furnished. She had 2 female attendants for a time. She had a screen behind which she could change her clothing with minimal privacy. She was watched constantly by 2 gendarmes who were stationed in the cell with her at all hours, a surveillance arrangement that made genuine privacy impossible and that was clearly designed as much to humiliate as to secure. Her hair had gone entirely white during her imprisonment in the Temple. She was 37 years old and looked considerably older. Visitors who saw her in the Conciergerie reported being struck by the contrast between the woman before them and the portraits of the young, beautiful queen they had known from before the Revolution. Her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal began on the 14th of October, 1793, and lasted 2 days. The charges against her were various accusations of sending money to Austria, of conspiring against the Republic, of influencing the king against the interests of France. The most disturbing moment of the trial came when the public prosecutor introduced an accusation that she had sexually abused her own son, a charge based on a statement that had been extracted from the 8-year-old Louis. Charles, under circumstances that made its reliability essentially zero. Marie Antoinette's response to this accusation has been recorded and remembered. She paused, then turned to the women in the public gallery and appealed to them directly as mothers, saying that nature itself recoiled from such a charge, and that any mother would understand why she could not dignify it with a response. The reaction in the courtroom was audible. Even in a tribunal that had processed hundreds of cases with mechanical efficiency, the moment landed differently. It did not change the verdict. Marie Antoinette was convicted and condemned to death. On the 16th of October, 1793, she was taken by open cart through the streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution. She had requested black mourning clothes for her execution and had been denied. She was given a simple white dress instead. On the cart, observed by the enormous crowds that lined the route, she maintained the composure that had defined her public behaviour since the revolution had turned against her. At the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the foot of the executioner and apologised, a detail so instinctively courteous in the middle of such a moment that it has stayed in the historical record ever since. She was executed at midday. She was 37 years old. The executions extended in every direction through the autumn and winter of 1793 into 1794. The Federalist cities that had revolted against Montagnard authority were suppressed with varying degrees of severity. Lyon, which had executed a Jacobin official and held out against Republican forces through a siege, was subjected to a systematic campaign of reprisal after its fall in October. The representative on mission sent by the convention, Joseph Fouché, who would later become Napoleon's police minister and demonstrate a talent for political survival that was genuinely extraordinary, oversaw executions on a scale that exceeded what the guillotine could manage efficiently. Groups of condemned prisoners were shot by cannon fire at the edge of mass graves. The convention's own records described these events in language that was both matter-of-fact and horrifying. Lyon was symbolically renamed Ville Affranchie, liberated city, and a decree was issued that portions of it should be demolished as punishment for its resistance. Very little of the demolition was actually carried out, but the intention was recorded. In the Vendée, the counter-revolutionary uprising that had begun in the spring of 1793 had become a genuine guerrilla war by autumn. The Republican armies sent to suppress it initially suffered significant reverses against Vendéan forces who knew their local terrain and fought with a tenacity rooted in genuine conviction, religious, royalist, and deeply local. When the Republican armies eventually gained the upper hand, the reprisals in the Vendée reached a scale that has generated historical debate about its characterization ever since. Republican columns, the colonnes infernales, the infernal columns moved through the region systematically, killing not just combatants but civilians, burning villages, destroying livestock, and leaving a landscape of devastation. The death toll in the Vendée through 1793 and 1794, combining combat deaths, reprisal killings, and the disease and starvation that followed military destruction, has been estimated by historians at figures ranging from 100,000 to 250,000 numbers that represent a significant portion of the region's pre-war population. Within Paris, the terror found new targets as the winter progressed. Georges Danton, one of the great figures of the early radical revolution, the man whose call to audacity had helped mobilize Paris in the crisis of 1792, had grown uncomfortable with the direction the Committee of Public Safety was taking. He called, with increasing openness, for a moderation of the terror for the committees of clemency that his ally Camille Desmoulins advocated in his newspaper Le Vieux Cordelier. Desmoulins had been a friend of Robespierre's since their student days. His newspaper was witty, pointed, and increasingly dangerous in the argument it was making, that the Republic was destroying itself, that the prison populations were full of innocent people, that the logic of permanent suspicion led nowhere, that a free people should want to go. Robespierre had Danton and Desmoulins arrested in the spring of 1794. The trial was brief. The charges included financial corruption. There was enough material in Danton's past dealings to construct a case, though the trial's outcome was predetermined. Danton's attempt to speak in his own defence was loud and unruly enough that the tribunal stopped the proceedings and convicted the defendants without allowing them to finish. He was executed on the 5th of April, 1794, along with Desmoulins and others. Danton reportedly told the executioner, as he faced the blade, to show his head to the people it was worth seeing. The line was recorded, probably accurately, because it was exactly the kind of thing Danton would have said, and because it contained a last flash of the personality that had made him one of the revolution's most vivid figures. The elimination of the Dantonists removed the last significant internal voice arguing for moderation. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety now operated without organised opposition within the convention, which did not mean without fear, because every surviving deputy had watched colleagues, friends, and political allies go to the guillotine, and the fear of being next was a permanent feature of the convention's internal atmosphere. Voting against the committee was dangerous. Asking inconvenient questions was dangerous. Even excessive silence could be interpreted as the silence of a man concealing treasonous thoughts. In June of 1794, the law of 22nd Prairial, named for the date on the revolutionary calendar, was passed. It accelerated the revolutionary tribunal's procedures further, eliminating the right of defendants to call witnesses or to have legal counsel, and reducing the possible verdicts to two: acquittal or death. The pace of executions in Paris accelerated sharply. The period between June and July of 1794, the Great Terror, as it has been called, produced more executions in a shorter period than any earlier phase. The guillotine was moved from the Place de la Révolution to the Place du Trône Renversé, the square of the overturned throne, partly because the blood and smell had become a nuisance in the more central location, and partly because the volume of work required a site with more space. Among those executed in this final phase were people whose connection to counter-revolution was, by any reasonable standard, tenuous to non-existent. Poets, scientists, former revolutionary officials, people caught in the expanding circles of guilt by association. The chemist Antoine Lavoisier, one of the most important scientists of the 18th century, was executed in May of 1794 on charges related to his former role as a tax farmer. The judge who signed his death warrant reportedly observed that the Republic had no need of scientists. Whether he actually said this has been disputed, but the sentiment it expressed was real enough in the atmosphere of the time. The human cost of the terror, taken across France as a whole, extended well beyond the guillotine's count in Paris. Historians have estimated that approximately 40,000 people were executed during the terror, roughly 17,000 by formal sentence. The remainder killed in the suppression of federalist revolts and the Vendée campaign, or through extrajudicial violence. A further 200 to 300,000 were imprisoned at various points. These numbers existed within a country of approximately 28 million people, which means that the terror, measured statistically, touched a small fraction of the total population. But statistics of this kind miss what it meant to live within a system where anyone could be denounced, where the standard of proof for arrest was minimal, where acquittal was possible but conviction was far more probable, and where the distance between ordinary life and a prison cell was, for a significant portion of the French population, uncomfortably short. The revolution had promised liberty, equality, and the rights of man. It had delivered, alongside genuine achievements that would outlast the terror, a system of political violence that consumed its own children, with a thoroughness that even its architects had not entirely planned. The question of how it had arrived there, how the principles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man had coexisted with the law of suspects, how the liberators had become the executioners would occupy historians, philosophers, and political theorists for the next 2 centuries and more. The answer, when it came, was never simple. It involved the pressure of war, the genuine threat of counter-revolution, the particular personalities of the men involved, the political culture of the Jacobin clubs, and something harder to name, the capacity of a movement convinced of its own righteousness to mistake the elimination of its opponents for the fulfillment of its ideals. Thermidor, The Revolution Devours, Robespierre. By the summer of 1794, the Committee of Public Safety had created something that its own members could not entirely control. A system of political terror so comprehensive and so indiscriminate that it had begun generating fear not just among the obvious enemies of the revolution, but among the revolution's own committed defenders. The deputies of the National Convention, who had watched colleagues, friends, and former allies disappear into the machinery of the Revolutionary Tribunal with increasing frequency, were living in a state of sustained anxiety that had become, by late July, almost unbearable. The question that occupied the private thoughts of nearly every surviving member of the convention was not abstract or philosophical. It was immediate and personal. When would it be their turn? Robespierre had been withdrawing from public appearances through June and into July of 1794. He stopped attending the Committee of Public Safety's regular meetings for several weeks, an absence that was itself a source of anxiety for those around him, since it was unclear what he was thinking, who he was meeting with, and what he was planning. When he reappeared at the convention on the 8th of Thermidor, the 26th of July, in the conventional calendar, it was with a speech that lasted over 2 hours, and that was, even by the standards of an era that valued oratory, an extraordinary performance. He spoke of virtue and the Republic. He spoke of conspiracies against the revolution. He spoke of enemies within the convention itself unnamed, which was in some ways worse than being named, because every deputy in the hall had reason to wonder if the unnamed enemy might be himself. He called for the purging of the Committee of Public Safety and the Committee of General Security. He implied, without specifying, that a new wave of arrests was coming, and in doing so, he made a tactical error that was, in retrospect, among the most consequential mistakes of the entire revolutionary period. By leaving his targets unnamed, he had not intimidated the convention into submission. He had frightened every single one of its members into the possibility that they were on his list, which meant that men, who might otherwise have continued their cautious silence, suddenly had a personal interest in acting before he could. The night of the 8th of Thermidor was spent in urgent, whispered conversations among deputies who had previously been too afraid to speak openly to each other about what they were thinking. The fear that had kept the convention paralysed for months was still present, but it was now competing with a different fear, the fear of what inaction would cost them personally. The conspirators who gathered that night included men from across the convention's political spectrum. Some were moderates, who had always been uncomfortable with the terror's excesses. Some were members of the Montagnard faction itself, men who had supported the Committee of Public Safety through its most violent period, and who now feared, with good reason, that they were among those Robespierre had in mind for elimination. Among the most active organisers were Joseph Fouché, who had been recalled from his brutal work in Lyon and feared Robespierre's judgment of his methods, and Jean-Lambert Tallien, whose companion Theresia Cabarrus was imprisoned in the conciergerie, and who had sent him a smuggled letter telling him to act or she would despise him. Tallien had more than ideological reasons for what he was about to do. The session of the 9th of Thermidor, the 27th of July, 1794, opened in the convention with the awareness, on the part of those who had spent the night organising, that what they were attempting had to succeed completely on the first attempt. There would be no second chance. Robespierre still commanded the loyalty of the Paris Commune, the radical municipal government that had been the social and political base of the Montagnard movement since August of 1792. If the convention moved against him and failed, if he managed to rally the sections and the sans-culottes as had been done before in moments of political crisis, the deputies who had acted against him would face the marred guillotine within days. Tallien rose to speak first, with a kind of desperate energy that observers noted. He accused the committee of tyranny, of operating without accountability, of having turned the instruments of the Republic against the Republic itself. He produced a dagger theatrically, with the instinct of a man who understood that political moments sometimes require props, and declared that if the convention failed to act, he would use it himself. Robespierre attempted to respond. He moved to the rostrum, called for silence, called for the president of the convention to hear him. The hall erupted. Deputies shouted him down. Men who had never dared interrupt him before were now yelling from their seats. The president rang his bell without effect. Robespierre stood at the rostrum, his voice failing against the noise, looking for an ally in the hall who would give him a moment's hearing. None came. The galleries, which in earlier sessions had been filled with Jacobin supporters, whose applause and intimidating presence had shaped many a convention vote, did not rally to him today. Saint-Just, who had risen to speak in Robespierre's defence, was also shouted down before he could deliver more than a few words, a remarkable thing, given that Saint-Just's cold authority had silenced rooms before. The vote to arrest Robespierre, his brother Augustin, Saint-Just, Georges Couthon, who was partially paralysed and attended the convention in a wheelchair, and Philippe Lebas passed quickly. The men who had sent hundreds to the guillotine were now themselves under arrest, in the same hall where they had presided over the terror. What followed through the rest of that day and into the night was not an orderly resolution, but a chaotic interlude that could have gone several ways. The arrested men were taken initially to the Luxembourg prison, but the prison governors, still uncertain which side was going to win, declined to admit them. Robespierre was eventually taken to the offices of the Committee of General Security. His supporters at the Paris Commune rang the tocsin, the alarm bell that had called Paris to action on so many previous occasions, and organised a gathering of armed men at the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall that had been the Commune's seat of power. Several of the arrested deputies were brought there, including Robespierre himself, who was moved from the committee offices to the Hôtel de Ville in the course of the evening. The insurrection in support of Robespierre did not materialise in the way his supporters at the Commune had hoped. The sections of Paris, which had provided the muscle for previous revolutionary crises, did not mobilise with anything, like the energy of August 1792 or the Journées of earlier years. The sans-culottes who gathered at the Hôtel de Ville through the evening hours drifted away as the night progressed, partly because it was raining, partly because the Commune's call to arms had not been accompanied by the kind of clear, energising message that had moved crowds before, and partly because the political mood of Paris had shifted in ways that were not yet fully visible, but that the evening was revealing. The republic that Robespierre had built had exhausted its most committed supporters. The men and women who had marched and fought and demonstrated through 5 years of revolutionary upheaval were tired in a way that one night's rain made evident. A force of convention troops entered the Hôtel de Ville in the early hours of the 10th of Thermidor. In the confused confrontation that followed, Le Bas shot himself. Augustin Robespierre jumped from a window and survived with a broken leg. Couthon was found at the bottom of a staircase, having apparently fallen or been thrown. Robespierre himself was found in the main hall with a shattered jaw, whether from a pistol shot fired by a gendarme named Murder or by his own hand in a failed suicide attempt, has never been definitively established, and may never be. The injury left him unable to speak clearly, which gave the morning that followed a strange, muffled quality. The man whose voice had defined the Jacobin Republic for 2 years was silenced before his trial. There was no real trial. The revolutionary tribunal that had processed hundreds of cases confirmed the identities of the arrested men. Formal identification was required before execution could proceed, and that was essentially the extent of the legal proceeding. Robespierre and 21 others were taken to the Place de la Révolution on the afternoon of the 10th of Thermidor. The route passed the Jacobin Club on the Rue Saint-Honoré, outside which a woman reportedly dipped her hands in a bucket and splashed blood on Robespierre's face, saying that his own blood would wash it away soon enough. Whether this is historical fact or revolutionary legend is unclear. It has the quality of a story that people wanted to be true. At the scaffold, the bandaging on Robespierre's jaw had to be removed for the blade to function. The removal was apparently painful. An involuntary cry was heard. He was 35 years old. Saint Just was executed alongside him with the composure that had characterized him throughout. He reportedly glanced at the Declaration of the Rights of Man, posted on the wall of the Revolutionary Tribunal as he was led out, and said nothing. Couthon, who had to be lifted onto the scaffold, went last. The reaction in Paris to the executions was not the sombre silence that had greeted the king's death 18 months earlier, nor the charged and complicated crowd response of earlier journées. It was, by most accounts, something closer to relief, a collective exhalation from a city that had been living under sustained pressure for too long. There were celebrations in some districts. In others, there was simply a quieter quality to the streets, as if the city were slowly remembering how to breathe normally. The Thermidorian reaction that followed moved quickly to dismantle the machinery of the terror. The law of 22nd Prairial, which had stripped defendants of their rights before the Revolutionary Tribunal, was repealed. The Revolutionary Tribunal itself was reformed, then eventually abolished. The Committee of Public Safety was stripped of its executive powers. The Jacobin Club of Paris was closed in November of 1794, its doors sealed by order of the Convention after a final session that devolved into chaos. The maximum the price controls on essential goods, that had been one of the Terror's economic instruments was abolished in December, releasing market prices and producing an immediate sharp increase in the cost of bread that hit working-class Paris harder than almost any other measure of the Thermidorian period. The political prisoners who had survived the Terror began to be released through the autumn of 1794. Many had been imprisoned for months without trial. They emerged into a Paris that was simultaneously familiar and transformed the same streets, the same neighbourhoods, but carrying the weight of everything that had happened since their arrest. Some returned to public life. Others retreated into private existence. A few wrote memoirs that provided some of the most vivid first-hand accounts of what the prisons had been like, what the Terror had felt like from inside the system it was consuming. The surviving Girondin deputies, those who had fled rather than been arrested in June of 1793, were allowed to return to the convention. Their reappearance shifted the political balance of the assembly noticeably toward the right. The sans-culotte movement that had powered the radical phase of the revolution found itself politically marginal in a way that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. The sections of Paris, whose permanent assemblies had been one of the engines of radical politics, were restricted in their meeting frequency and influence. The Muscadins, fashionable young men from the wealthier classes, who had survived the Terror and now sported extravagant counter-revolutionary fashions, deliberately wide collars and oddly cut coats, as a kind of peacocking statement of political mood, appeared on the streets of Paris and attacked Jacobin clubs and radical meeting places with a rowdy confidence that would have been suicidal under Robespierre. The Thermidorian reaction was not a restoration. It was a correction, a pulling back from the extreme that the Terror had represented, toward something that was itself unstable, and that carried the imprint of exhaustion rather than genuine political resolution. The men who had made the 9th of Thermidor were not united by a shared vision of what France should become. They were united by the shared fear that Robespierre had been about to have them killed. That kind of unity does not produce coherent government. It produces a vacuum. The young Louis Charles, the child who had been separated from his mother and placed in Republican education, died in the Temple prison in June of 1795 of tuberculosis and the conditions of his confinement. He was 10 years old. The circumstances of his final months have never been fully reconstructed, and the question of what exactly happened to him generated conspiracy theories for decades, including persistent claims, eventually disproven by DNA analysis, that he had escaped and been replaced. He had not escaped. He had simply died in a damp prison, without adequate care, of a disease that the conditions of his imprisonment had done nothing to resist. It was among the quieter tragedies of a period that was not short of them. France needed, after Thermidor, a government that could provide stability without replicating either the paralysis of the constitutional monarchy or the violence of the Committee of Public Safety. What it got instead was the Directory, a 5-man executive body established by the Constitution of the Year 3, which came into force in the autumn of 1795. It would prove to be neither stable nor particularly competent, and it would last 4 years before a young general whose name was already becoming familiar across Europe decided that he could do considerably better. The Directory, Napoleon's shadow, and what it all left behind. The Directory that governed France from the autumn of 1795 was, by almost any measure, an uninspiring institution. 5 directors rotated through executive authority, checking each other's ambitions with a thoroughness that also checked their effectiveness. The bicameral legislature, a council of 500 and a council of ancients, debated with the energy that French political culture had developed over 6 years of revolution, but without the sense of historical urgency that had given earlier assemblies their peculiar intensity. The men who ran the Directory were not villains, for the most part. They were survivors politicians who had navigated the Terror by being sufficiently inconspicuous, sufficiently flexible, or sufficiently useful, and who now found themselves governing a country that was exhausted, economically damaged, and politically fractured in ways that 5 years of upheaval had only deepened. The economy was in serious difficulty. The assignat, the paper currency backed by nationalized church lands that the Revolution had introduced in 1790, had been printed in such quantities through the years of the Terror that it had effectively collapsed. By 1796, its value had fallen to a tiny fraction of its nominal worth. Prices were volatile. The abolition of the maximum in December of 1794 had released market forces that working-class Paris was poorly positioned to absorb. The winter of 1794 to 95 had been one of the coldest in memory. Rivers froze, including the Seine, and the combination of cold, inflation, and food shortages produced genuine suffering in the urban working class that rivaled anything the years before 1789 had delivered. Two popular uprisings, the Journées of Germinal and Prairial in the spring of 1795, were suppressed by the Convention, with a firmness that demonstrated how completely the political relationship between the Thermidorian government and the sans-culotte movement had broken down. The radical popular energy that had been one of the revolution's defining forces was, by the middle of 1795, effectively defeated as a political actor. The Directory managed the war with more competence than it managed domestic affairs, partly because it had, in the armies of the Republic, an institution that the Revolution had genuinely transformed. The levée en masse, the mass conscription decree of August 1793, which had mobilized the entire nation for war in a way that European warfare had not previously seen, had created French armies that were large, motivated by revolutionary ideology, and led increasingly by officers who had risen on the basis of demonstrated ability rather than aristocratic birth. Lazare Carnot's organizational work had built a military machine that was beginning, by the mid-1790s, to demonstrate what it was capable of. French forces had rolled back the coalition armies from French territory by 1794. By 1795, Prussia and Spain had made separate peace agreements with France. The war continued primarily against Britain and Austria, but the existential threat to the Republic that had been used to justify the Terror had passed. Into this context stepped a young general from Corsica who had come to the Revolution's attention through a combination of genuine military talent, impeccable Jacobin credentials in the right period, and an instinct for positioning himself usefully at moments of political crisis. Napoleon Bonaparte had first made a significant impression at the siege of Toulon in 1793, where his artillery tactics had contributed decisively to the Republican recapture of the city from Royalist and British forces. He had come close to the guillotine in the Thermidorian reaction. His connections to the Robespierre circle were known, but had survived, recovered his standing, and demonstrated his value to the Directory in October of 1795, when he used artillery against a royalist uprising in Paris, the 13 Vendémiaire episode, with a brisk efficiency that the Directory found both useful and impressive. In 1796, the Directory gave Napoleon command of the Army of Italy, a posting that was not, at the time, considered the most prestigious assignment the Republic had to offer. The Italian campaign that followed transformed him from a promising general into a European figure. Moving through northern Italy with a speed and audacity that repeatedly wrong-footed the Austrian forces opposing him, winning battles at Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli, negotiating treaties on his own authority that went well beyond his military mandate, and sending back to Paris a steady stream of looted Italian artworks that decorated the Directory's political capital Napoleon, demonstrated in Italy that he was operating in a category of military talent that the Republic had not previously produced. He also demonstrated that he had political instincts and personal ambitions that went considerably beyond the execution of orders from the 5 directors in Paris. By 1798, the Directory's accumulated failures, financial instability, political corruption, military setbacks in the Rhine and in Egypt where Napoleon had taken a French army on what proved to be an ultimately unsuccessful Eastern adventure, had produced a government that was broadly despised and that lacked the legitimacy to reform itself from within. Elections had been manipulated, coups had been launched and survived. The The Directory itself had been founded on the suppression of one attempted royalist coup and had survived a Jacobin one. The political exhaustion of a country that had been through a decade of revolutionary upheaval was palpable, and it found expression in a widespread longing for order and stability that was not particular about the form those things took. Napoleon returned from Egypt in October of 1799, leaving his army behind, a fact that his subsequent propaganda managed to render considerably less damaging than it deserved to be. He found a political situation that, with careful preparation and the support of key figures, including his brother Lucien and the former revolutionary minister Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, who had helped declare the National Assembly into existence a decade earlier, and who now hoped to use Napoleon as a tool for constitutional renovation, could be managed toward an outcome. On the 18th and 19th of Brumaire, the 8th and 9th of November 1799, the coup that ended the Directory and replaced it with the Consulate was executed with mixed competence. Napoleon's own performance before the Council of 500 on the 19th was, by all accounts, poor. He stumbled, appeared to faint, was jostled and shouted at, and had to be rescued by his brother Lucien, who convinced the accompanying soldiers that he was being attacked by assassins. The soldiers cleared the hall. The rump of the legislature that remained voted the necessary measures. The Directory was over. Napoleon became First Consul of France, the dominant figure of a three-man executive that was, in practice, a personal government with constitutional decoration. He would become consul for life in 1802 and Emperor of the French in 1804, completing a trajectory from revolutionary general to hereditary monarch that contained enough historical irony to sustain several separate observations. A revolution that had executed a king for claiming divine authority had produced, within 15 years, an emperor who commissioned the Pope to attend his coronation and then, in a gesture that captured something essential about Napoleon's relationship to power, took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head himself. What the French Revolution actually left behind once the blood had dried and the Directory had collapsed and Napoleon had remade the political landscape is a question worth sitting with carefully. The immediate human cost had been enormous. The best estimates suggest that somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 people died in the Vendée alone, combining combat, reprisal, and the disease and starvation that followed military destruction. 40,000 were formally executed during the Terror. Hundreds of thousands were imprisoned. The emigration had drained France of a significant portion of its educated and administrative classes. The wars of the Revolution, which blended into the Napoleonic Wars, would eventually cost France and Europe millions of lives before they concluded at Waterloo in 1815. Against this, the Revolution produced changes that proved genuinely permanent and that reshaped not just France but the political imagination of the modern world. Feudalism ended in France not in the gradual, negotiated way it had slowly dissolved in England over centuries, but in a single August night, and it did not come back. The legal equality of citizens before the law, regardless of birth, regardless of estate, became the foundation on which the Napoleonic Code was later built. And the Napoleonic Code spread across Europe in the wake of French armies, carrying with it principles that outlasted the French occupation of the territories that received them. The principle that governments derived their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, that sovereignty resided in the nation rather than in the person of the monarch, entered European political discourse in a way it never entirely left. Even the monarchies that restored themselves after Napoleon's defeat found it necessary to accommodate, to varying degrees, the changed expectations of populations that had been exposed to the revolutionary period's ideas about rights, representation, and the relationship between states and citizens. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was the document that carried these ideas most directly into later history. Imperfect, incomplete, contradicted by much of what the revolution did in its own name, it nonetheless established a standard that subsequent generations could measure their own societies against. The abolitionists who fought against slavery in the 19th century, the suffragists who demanded women's political rights, the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century, all of them found in the Declaration a language for claims that their own circumstances gave them reason to make. The revolution had not delivered on its promises, but it had made the promises in a form that could not be unmade, and that created its own pressure across subsequent generations. The revolution also left France with something less easily categorized, a political culture marked permanently by the experience of what had happened between 1789 and 1799. The French capacity for political argument, for factional intensity, for the conviction that ideas carry real stakes, and that governments can be changed by collective action. These are not simply national characteristics. They are, in significant part, the inheritance of a decade in which those things were demonstrated to be literally true at enormous cost. French politics through the 19th and into the 20th century bore the marks of the revolutionary decade in its recurring cycles of republic, empire, and restoration. France went through 5 republics before settling into the one it currently inhabits, as if the political culture were still working through the implications of what had begun in 1789. The Bastille no longer stands. The Place de la Révolution has been the Place de la Concorde for a long time now, a broad, elegant square in the heart of Paris where tourists photograph the Egyptian obelisk that replaced the guillotine, and where the traffic moves in the complicated circular patterns that Parisian drivers have made their own. Versailles still stands open to visitors, its hall of mirrors reflecting tourists rather than courtiers, its gardens still geometrically precise in the way Louis XIV's landscape architects intended. The Conciergerie still stands on the Île de la Cité, its medieval towers rising from the riverbank, a museum now that contains a reconstruction of Marie Antoinette's cell and receives several 100,000 visitors every year. The revolutionary calendar lasted 12 years before Napoleon abolished it and returned France to the Gregorian system, one of his more practical decisions. The metric system lasted rather longer. What the French Revolution means, whether it was, on balance, a catastrophe or a liberation, or both simultaneously, is a question that has never been fully settled and probably never will be. It generated, in Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, the 2 most influential frameworks for thinking about political change that the modern world possesses: the conservative argument that accumulated tradition carries wisdom that abstract reason cannot replace, and the radical argument that inherited injustice cannot be defended simply by its age. Both arguments remain alive. Both contain real insight. Both fail when pushed to their extremes in ways that the revolution itself demonstrated. The men and women who made it, the deputies who took the tennis court oath, the women who marched to Versailles, the soldiers who stormed the Bastille, the prisoners who waited in the Conciergerie, the farmers who burned the records of their feudal obligations, the journalists who filled Paris with argument and accusation, were not abstract historical forces. They were people living through events that no one had scripted and no one fully controlled, trying to make decisions under pressure with incomplete information and competing loyalties. In a country that had decided it could no longer continue as it had been, they got a great deal wrong. They also changed the world. That is, in the end, what the French Revolution was. Not a triumph, not a catastrophe, but a reckoning the moment when one of the most powerful societies in human history looked at itself honestly enough to find the contradiction at its centre, and violent enough in its response to ensure that the contradiction could never be fully ignored again. And so France, after 10 years of revolution, trial, and transformation, settled into something quieter. Not peace exactly, but the particular stillness that follows a storm when the wind finally drops and people begin the slow work of assessing what remains standing. The men who had stood in that tennis court on a June afternoon in 1789 cold, determined, signing their names to an oath that none of them was entirely sure they could keep, could not have imagined what would follow. The world they were trying to build arrived. eventually. Not in the form they planned, not through the means they would have chosen, and not without a cost that would have horrified most of them. But it arrived. The principles they wrote down, that people have rights that governments are obliged to respect, that authority requires justification, that the law belongs to everyone, are still the ground on which modern political life stands, however imperfectly. Somewhere in Paris tonight, the Seine is moving through the city in the dark, past the Ile de la Cité, where the conciergerie still rises from the riverbank, past the broad Place de la Concorde, where so much of this history reached its sharpest point. The city has been through a great deal since 1789. It carries that history in its stones and its streets, in the names of its squares and the layout of its arrondissements, the very administrative divisions that the National Assembly designed when it was trying to build a rational country out of a feudal one. The guillotine is gone, the Bastille is gone, the kings are gone. What remains is a republic, France's fifth, durable and imperfect, and a set of ideas that spread outward from the events of these 10 years into the wider world, finding their way into constitutions and declarations and arguments that are still being made, in various languages, in various circumstances, by people who may not know exactly where the language they are using first found its form. Let that settle quietly now. You have travelled a long way tonight, through the bread markets of Paris, through the tennis court at Versailles, through the October rain on the road from the capital to the palace, through the long corridors of the conciergerie, through the noise of the convention on the 9th of Thermidor. That is a considerable amount of history for one evening. You can rest too now. The revolution has run its course. The story is told. Close your eyes. Let the images go soft, the torchlight, the crowds, the stone towers of the Bastille dissolving into the dark, and drift toward wherever sleep takes you. It has been a pleasure, as always, to spend this time in history with you.